What if the flood was never about punishing the wicked? What if it was about erasing a world that had grown beyond control? Imagine standing on the plains of ancient Mesopotamia in the final hours before everything changed. The sky darkens not with storm clouds, but with something else. A shadow that moves wrong. The air tastes of copper and ozone. Animals that should be grazing stand frozen, staring at the horizon. Birds that should be singing have gone silent. And in the distance where the Euphrates has flowed for 10,000 years, the water begins to rise, not gradually, not with warning, but with the sudden, inevitable momentum of a system executing a command, a protocol, a reset. Before we go further into what might be history's most misunderstood catastrophe, take a moment. Like this video if you've ever questioned the stories we were taught. Subscribe if you're drawn to the kind of history that refuses to stay buried. And leave a comment telling me where you are right now and what time it is. I want to imagine this story unfolding across time zones, carried into sleep by voices in 100 cities, while the rain falls outside windows in places that remember floods. Because every place remembers floods. We have been told for millennia that the Great Flood was punishment, divine judgment against a humanity that had become too wicked, too corrupt, too violent to be allowed to continue. God looked down, saw that every inclination of the human heart was evil, and decided to wipe the slate clean, start over, preserve only the righteous, destroy everything else, teach the survivors a lesson about obedience. This is the story in Genesis. The Hebrew Noah, 600 years old, receiving instructions to build an ark while his neighbors mocked him, gathering animals 2 by 2, watching the fountains of the deep break open and the windows of heaven pour forth water until even the mountains were covered. 150 days of floating above a drowned world, waiting for the anger to pass. The story appears in Mesopotamia thousands of years before the Hebrew version was written. The Akkadian Atrahasis, warned by the god Enki that Enlil had grown wary of human noise and decided to send a flood. The Sumerian Ziusudra, instructed to build a boat and seal it with bitumen while the divine council debated the fate of humanity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim describes the storm that raged for 6 days and 7 nights, turning brothers into strangers and the earth into ocean. In India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, the first man, warned by a fish that grew impossibly large and revealed itself as Vishnu. "Build a boat," the fish said. "Tee it to my horn when the waters come. I will pull you to safety while everything else drowns." And Manu obeyed, and survived, and became the father of the next humanity. The Greeks remembered Deucalion and Para, sole survivors of Zeus's flood, sent to cleanse the earth of the Bronze Age men who had become too violent and too proud. They landed on Mount Parnassus, made sacrifice, and were told to throw stones over their shoulders. The stones became new humans, a fresh start, a second attempt. Different names, different details, but the structure remains constant. Divine beings decide humanity has failed. Water is chosen as the method of cleansing. One family is warned. A vessel is built, the world drowns, and from the wreckage, a new age begins. Humbler, smaller, reset. For thousands of years this narrative satisfied us, it made moral sense. Bad behavior brings consequences. Divine beings hold us accountable. The flood was justice, terrible but deserved. A cosmic spanking that left humanity chastened and grateful for the mercy of survival. But there is a problem with this interpretation. Actually, several problems. And they have been accumulating quietly in the background of archaeology, geology, and climatology for the past century, waiting for someone to ask the question that theology has always avoided. If the flood was punishment for wickedness, why does the geological evidence show it happened at the exact moment of a cosmic catastrophe? Around 12,800 years ago, something struck the earth. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, multiple fragments of a comet, torn apart by tidal forces as it passed too close to the sun, impacted the northern hemisphere in a cascade of explosions that would make our largest nuclear weapons look like firecrackers. The evidence is written in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment layers across North America, in the extinction record of 37 genera of megafauna that vanished within a geological instant. The impact sites targeted the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacial formation that covered Canada and the northern United States. Each impact released energy equivalent to millions of megatons, instantly vaporizing billions of tons of ice. The meltwater didn't trickle into the ocean. It exploded into it. Sea levels rose 400 feet over the course of a few thousand years, drowning coastlines where human beings had been living for tens of thousands of years. This is not speculation. This is data. Platinum spikes in the sediment. Nanodiamonds formed under impossible pressure. Charcoal layers indicating continental-scale wildfires. The Younger Dryas boundary. a black mat of destruction that circles the globe at exactly the depth corresponding to 12,800 years before present. A line in the earth that separates the world that was from the world that came after. If the flood was divine punishment, why does it align perfectly with a cosmic impact event? If God was angry at human wickedness, why did he wait until a comet happened to fragment in Earth's path? The timing is too precise to be coincidence. And that precision suggests something far stranger than punishment. It suggests design. It suggests that someone, somewhere, with knowledge of celestial mechanics and access to forces we can barely comprehend, used the comet not as an accident but as a tool, not punishment. Reset. Think about what a reset means in the context we understand. When a computer system becomes corrupted, when its processes spiral out of control, when it begins consuming resources faster than it can manage them, we don't punish the computer. We don't lecture it about its moral failures. We reset it. We restore it to factory settings. We wipe the memory, preserve only the essential operating system, and let it begin again. What if the flood was exactly this? What if humanity before the flood had reached a point where continuation was no longer sustainable? Not because we were morally wicked, though wickedness is always present, but because we had exceeded the parameters of the system, because we had multiplied too fast, consumed too much, learned too quickly, become too difficult to manage. The ancient texts hint at this without stating it directly. In the Atrahasis epic, the god Enlil's complaint is not about sin. It is about noise. The clamor of humanity has become unbearable. The land has become too full, sleep is impossible. The divine council convenes not to judge morality but to solve a population problem. The solution discussed is not repentance. Introduction first, they try plague. It does not work. Humanity adapts famine. Still, humanity survives. Enki, the god of wisdom, keeps teaching humans how to find food, how to irrigate, how to endure. Finally, Enlil proposes the ultimate solution: flood, total, absolute, comprehensive, not selective, not targeted at the wicked while sparing the righteous. Just erase everything and start over. This is not the language of punishment. This is the language of system failure. This is an engineer looking at a project that has spiraled beyond its design specifications and deciding that patching is no longer viable. The only option left is reformatting the drive. But here is where it becomes strange, stranger than cosmic impacts or divine councils. Because if the goal was total erasure, why warn anyone? Why give Yasudra instructions? Why tell Atrahasis to build a boat? Why teach Noah the measurements of the ark, the thickness of the bitumen, the timing of the bird releases? If you want to reset a system completely, you do not preserve backup files. You do not create recovery protocols. You do not leave escape routes. Unless the reset was never about ending humanity. Unless it was about ending a specific version of humanity. A version that had grown too advanced, too knowledgeable, too independent, and replacing it with a version that would start over, slower, humbler, more manageable, preserve the genetic stock, preserve the essential knowledge, preserve the memory of what happened so the survivors will fear the gods and obey, but erase the infrastructure, erase the cities, erase the accumulated technology and the organizational capacity that made pre-flood humanity a threat to divine control. Reset the world to an earlier save point before cities, before writing, before the Nephilim, the giants, the hybrids who carried divine genetics in mortal bodies and could challenge the gods themselves. Send humanity back to the beginning, but not all the way back. Keep the seed. Destroy the tree. The rain begins to fall in earnest now, in that imagined moment before history fractures. The people who live along the rivers do not yet understand what is coming. They have seen floods before. Seasonal, manageable, the kind that leave fertile silt and renew the fields. This feels different, but they do not have the language yet to describe how. They do not know that far to the north, ice sheets 2 miles thick are collapsing into the ocean. They do not know that the coasts where their ancestors built the first cities, the places they still visit in summer to fish and trade, will be gone within a generation, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of seawater that will never recede. They do not know that they are living in the final chapter of the first world, the world before the reset. The world that will be remembered only in fragments, in myths, in stories passed down by the handful who survive and carry the memory forward into the age of forgetting. Somewhere in the chaos, a man is building a boat that makes no sense. It is too large, it is too far from water. His neighbors think he is insane, but he has been warned, not by conscience, not by moral intuition, by someone who broke ranks, someone who looked at the reset protocol and decided that total erasure was wrong. That humanity, whatever its flaws, deserved a chance to continue. That knowledge, however dangerous, should not be completely lost. And so the boat rises on dry land, sealed with pitch, loaded with animals and seeds and clay tablets wrapped in oiled leather. inscribed with star charts and mathematical formulas, and the names of gods who will not answer prayers for a very long time. The reset is coming, not because humanity sinned, but because humanity succeeded. And success in a system designed for control is the most dangerous thing of all. To understand what was reset, we must first understand what existed before the waters came. And here the archaeological record becomes uncomfortable, because the world that drowned was not primitive. It was not the savage, stone-wielding humanity we imagine when we think of prehistory. It was something far more sophisticated, and the evidence for this exists not in mythology, but in clay. In the ruins of Nippur, buried beneath centuries of sand and the accumulated debris of later civilizations, archaeologists found a document that should not exist. Not because it was impossible to create, but because it was impossible to believe. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it opens with a sentence that has troubled scholars for over a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not emerged, not developed, not evolved, descended from above, from somewhere else, given rather than earned. And what follows is a chronicle of rulers whose reigns shatter every assumption we hold about human history and the limits of human lifespan. Ululim, the first king, reigned for 28,800 years, Alauga II for 36,000 years, and Menluana, the third for 3,200 years. The list continues through 8 kings, each governing for spans of time that exceed the entire recorded history of civilization as we know it. In total, these pre-flood rulers governed for 201,200 years, not decades, not centuries, not even millennia. Entire epochs measured in astronomical cycles, in the slow turning of the stars, in timeframes that make the rise and fall of Rome look like a single breath. Then the flood swept over, one sentence, abrupt, final, no elaboration, no explanation, just the acknowledgement that something ended, and after that line everything changes. The kings who follow rule for hundreds of years, then decades, then lifespans that begin to approach human mortality. The impossible gives way to the merely exaggerated. The cosmic collapses into the historical. Scholars dismiss the flood numbers as symbolic, as mythological inflation meant to grant divine legitimacy to later rulers. But this interpretation ignores a critical detail. The Sumerian king list was not written as poetry. It was not a hymn or a prayer. It was a bureaucratic document, etched in the same cuneiform script used for grain receipts and tax records. It was copied and recopied across centuries with the same careful precision scribes used for astronomical tables and mathematical formulas. The Sumerians were obsessively precise. They did not round numbers, they did not approximate. When they recorded that a worker received 3 1/2 measures of barley, they meant exactly that. Not about 3, not roughly 4, exactly 3 1/2. So when they recorded that Ululim reigned for 28,800 years, what did they mean? Some researchers have proposed that the numbers encode astronomical cycles rather than individual lifespans. The Sumerians measured time in units called sar, equivalent to 3,600 years. Ululim's reign of 28,800 years equals 8 sar exactly. Alauga's 36,000 years equals 10 sar. And Menluana's 43,200 years equals 12 sar. The pattern holds across all 8 pre-flood kings. These are not random exaggerations. They are calculated measurements, but measurements of what? If not lifespans, then what? Perhaps epochs, ages, dynasties that lasted not for a single ruler's lifetime, but for entire cycles of celestial motion. Perhaps kingship before the flood was not individual but institutional. Perhaps the names on the king list represent not persons but systems of governance that persisted across millennia, maintained by beings who did not age the way humans age, who did not die the way humans die, who measured time not in heartbeats but in the precession of stars. The cities these kings ruled were real. Eridu, the first city, has been excavated. Its ruins stretch back nearly 8,000 years, layer upon layer of temples built and rebuilt on the same sacred ground. Bad Tabira, the second city, where Alauga reigned. Larak, Sippar, Shurapak, all mentioned in the king list, all confirmed by archaeology as genuine ancient settlements. These were not imaginary places. They were the anchors of a civilization that kept records, that valued precision, that documented everything from the movement of Venus to the wages of temple workers. So why would they list kings who ruled for impossible lengths of time unless those lengths, however we interpret them, reflected something real? And what was real, according to the tablets themselves, was a world fundamentally different from the one that came after. A world where the boundary between divine and mortal, between heaven and earth, between creator and created, had not yet hardened into the separation we take for granted. The Atrahasis epic, older than the Hebrew Bible by over 1,000 years, describes how this world began, not with spoken commands or divine breath, but with labor, with exhaustion, with a project that had become unsustainable. In the beginning, the text says, the gods did all the work. The younger deities, dug irrigation channels, they dredged rivers, they built temples. For 3,600 years, they labored, and then they revolted. They burned their tools, they marched on the assembly of the elder gods, and they demanded relief. The solution proposed by Enki, the god of wisdom, was extraordinary. Let humanity be created. Let them bear the yoke of the gods. Let them do the work so the divine can rest. But creating humanity was not instantaneous. It was not effortless. The tablets describe a process that reads less like mythology and more like experimental biology. Enki and the birth goddess Ninhursag mixed clay from the earth with the blood of a slain god. They shaped forms. They tested prototypes. Some could not speak. Some could not walk. Some adjustments were made, formulas refined, until finally a viable model emerged. Humans who could work, who could breed, who could maintain the infrastructure of civilization without requiring divine intervention. Not slaves exactly, but biological machines designed for a specific purpose. Workers who would not rebel because rebellion requires imagination, and imagination had not yet been coded into the design. This was the world before the flood. Not a paradise, not a golden age of moral perfection, but a functioning system. Humans performing the tasks they were engineered to perform. Gods overseeing from a distance, intervening only when necessary. A hierarchy as rigid as it was effective, and then something went wrong. The tablets describe it with clinical precision. The work had been too successful. Humanity multiplied beyond projections. The population grew exponentially, and with numbers came noise. Not just literal sound, though the texts mention that too, the clamor that disturbed divine sleep, but noise in the sense of complexity, of unpredictability, of deviation from the original design. Humans began to develop culture, art, music, individuality. They began to ask questions that workers are not supposed to ask. Why do we serve? Who decided this hierarchy? What would happen if we stopped? Enlil, the god who administered the system, recognized the problem immediately. Humans were exceeding their programming. They were becoming something other than what they had been designed to be. And worse, they were interbreeding with the divine, the Nephilim, the giants, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. This is how Genesis describes them, briefly, almost as an afterthought in chapter 6. But the Book of Enoch, excluded from most biblical canons but preserved by Ethiopian Christians, tells the story in full. 200 watchers, divine beings assigned to observe humanity, descended to Mount Hermon. They took human wives. They taught forbidden knowledge, astronomy, herbology, cosmetics, warfare, sorcery, and from these unions came the Nephilim, beings who carried divine genetics in mortal bodies, who grew to enormous size, who possessed strength and intelligence beyond human limits, who became the heroes of old, the men of renown, the demigods who walked the earth and challenged the order of heaven itself. This was not part of the design. This was contamination, hybridization, the blurring of boundaries that were supposed to remain absolute. And it was spreading. The texts describe a world where the line between human and divine had become so blurred that the original purpose, the original function of humanity, was being lost in the noise. The system was failing, not because humans were morally evil, though evil certainly existed, but because they had outgrown their role. They had learned too much, become too complex, begun to resemble their creators in ways that made creators uncomfortable. In any other context, we would call this success. A created intelligence developing beyond its initial parameters, achieving autonomy, demonstrating creativity and adaptability. But from the perspective of those who created it, who designed it for a specific function, who depended on it remaining within defined limits, this was catastrophe. The divine council convened, not in anger, the texts suggest, but in concern. The Igigi gods, who had originally demanded the creation of humanity to relieve their labor, now found themselves dealing with a creation that required more management than the original work had demanded. Humans needed food, which meant maintaining agriculture. They needed governance, which meant establishing law. They needed education, which meant transmitting knowledge. And now they needed control because they were beginning to realize they had options. Enlil's position was clear. The experiment had failed, not partially, fundamentally. Humans were no longer fit for purpose. The Nephilim were an abomination. The whole system had become corrupted beyond repair. The only solution was termination, complete, absolute. Erase humanity and start over, either with a better design or not at all. But Enki, who had engineered humans in the first place, who had mixed the clay and the blood, who had spent eons teaching them survival skills when plagues and famines came, objected. Humanity had exceeded its design, yes. But that exceeded was not failure, it was evolution. It was proof that the creation contained potential the creators had not anticipated. To destroy that potential, Enki argued, would be waste. And worse, it would be admission that the gods themselves had miscalculated, had created something they could not control, had proven less wise than they claimed to be. The debate raged across time we cannot measure, and while it raged, the pre-flood world continued. Cities sprawled across the plains of Mesopotamia. The Nephilim ruled as kings, as warriors, as priests who mediated between heaven and earth. Humans built ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids designed as landing platforms for gods who came and went with decreasing frequency. Knowledge accumulated, writing emerged, mathematics developed. Astronomy charted the stars with precision that would not be matched for thousands of years. This was the world that existed before the reset, not primitive, not savage, sophisticated to the point of threatening divine monopoly on knowledge and power. A world where humanity had begun to reach toward heaven not through prayer, but through engineering. Where the gap between mortal and divine was closing not through divine grace, but through human effort. And that world, the tablets tell us, could not be allowed to continue. The decision was made, not unanimously, not without dissent, but made nonetheless. The flood would come, the system would be reset, humanity would be reduced to a manageable population. The Nephilim would be eliminated, the accumulated knowledge would be drowned, and from the wreckage, a new age would begin, an age where humans would be smaller, weaker, shorter-lived, and most importantly forgetful. But one provision was included, one exception to total erasure. A single family would be warned, a boat would be built, and through that boat, the seed of humanity would survive. Not all of humanity, not the Nephilim, not the hybrid bloodlines, not the cities or the knowledge or the organizational complexity. Just the seed, the basic genetic template, the minimum viable population to restart the species, along with instructions encoded in memory and myth to never again reach so high. To remember what happened when creation challenged creator, to fear the flood, to obey the gods. The reset was being prepared, and the pre-flood world, magnificent and terrible, advanced and doomed, continued its final days unaware that the cosmic button was about to be pressed. If you want to erase a civilization without leaving evidence of deliberate destruction, you do not send armies. You do not deploy weapons that leave craters and radiation signatures. You do not announce your intentions or give time for resistance to organize. You use water. You use climate, use forces so vast and so apparently natural that survivors will interpret them as acts of God rather than acts of engineering. And you use the sky. In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published findings that would quietly revolutionize our understanding of Earth's recent geological history. They had been studying a thin layer of sediment found at archaeological sites across North America, a dark band of soil dated to approximately 12,800 years ago. Embedded in this layer were materials that should not exist naturally on Earth's surface: nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals that form only under extreme pressure and heat, the kind generated by cosmic impacts or nuclear explosions; magnetic spherules, tiny beads of iron melted at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, then rapidly cooled into perfect spheres; iridium, a rare element uncommon in Earth's crust but abundant in asteroids and comets; carbon spherules, evidence of biomass burned at such intensity that organic matter vitrified into glass; and perhaps most telling, a platinum anomaly. A spike in platinum concentration 300 times higher than background levels, spread across the entire northern hemisphere at precisely the same depth in the geological record. This is not the signature of gradual climate change, this is the signature of impact. Multiple impacts. A fragmented comet torn apart by tidal forces as it passed near the sun, raining down on Earth in a cascade of explosions that ignited forests, vaporized ice sheets, and threw so much debris into the atmosphere that the planet darkened for years. The event has a name now, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And while debate continues about specific details, the physical evidence becomes harder to dismiss with each new study. Something struck Earth 12,800 years ago. Something big enough to leave a scar in the geological record that circles the globe. Something powerful enough to trigger a climate shift so abrupt that it reversed a warming trend that had lasted for millennia and plunged the northern hemisphere back into near glacial conditions within a single human lifetime. The timing matters, because 12,800 years ago is exactly when the Sumerian king list says the flood came. Exactly when the Younger Dryas began, that strange cold snap that interrupted the steady warming at the end of the Ice Age. Exactly when megafauna across North America and Europe went extinct. Not gradually over thousands of years, but suddenly, catastrophically, in numbers that suggest environmental collapse rather than hunting pressure. And the location of the impacts matters even more. The fragments did not strike randomly across the globe. They targeted the Laurentide ice sheet, The massive glacial formation that covered Canada and the northern United States, 2 miles thick in places, containing enough frozen water to raise global sea levels by hundreds of feet if it melted. Each impact released energy equivalent to millions of megatons. The ice did not melt gradually, it exploded, vaporized into steam that shot into the atmosphere, liquefied into meltwater that carved channels through bedrock, creating the Scablons of Washington state, a landscape of giant ripple marks and dry waterfalls that looks like it was shaped by floods of biblical proportion. Because it was. The meltwater did not trickle into the ocean, it surged. Meltwater pulse, geologists call it, a catastrophic rise in sea level that occurred over just a few centuries, 400 feet of vertical rise. Coastlines that had been stable for tens of thousands of years, where humans had built settlements and developed cultures, vanished beneath waves that came too fast to outrun. If you lived on the coast 12,000 years ago, if your entire world consisted of the shoreline communities where fishing was easy and trade routes connected distant peoples, you would have watched the sea advance year by year, generation by generation, swallowing everything. Your grandparents' village would be underwater, your parents' fields would be saltwater marsh, and your children would retreat further inland, carrying with them only what they could carry: tools, seeds, stories, memory of a world that drowned. This is the geological mechanism of the reset. Impact triggers melt, melt triggers flood, flood erases coastal civilization. No divine hand needed, just physics, just the intersection of cosmic debris and planetary ice at exactly the right moment to produce exactly the right catastrophe. Except for one problem. Comets do not aim. Fragments from a disintegrating comet spread across orbital space in a debris field that can span millions of miles. The odds of multiple fragments all hitting the same ice sheet, all within the same narrow time window, all positioned to produce maximum flooding rather than random destruction, are astronomically small. Unless someone was aiming. The ancient texts describe weapons, not metaphorical weapons, not symbolic divine wrath, weapons, devices, technology that could manipulate the elements, that could call down fire from heaven, that could split the earth and overturn the sea. The Era epic, an Akkadian text from the 8th century BCE but copying much older Sumerian sources, describes the god Era preparing to destroy humanity. He does not simply command and it happens. He assembles weapons. The text lists them. The 7, they are called. Weapons that can stir up the sea, that can split mountains, that can darken the sky. Weapons so terrible that even the other gods fear them. When Era deploys these weapons, the description is clinical. The sea roars, the land splits, fire rains from above, the foundations of the earth are shaken. This is not poetry. This is someone trying to describe impact events, massive energy releases, geological disruption using the only vocabulary available to a Bronze Age scribe. In Hindu texts, the Mahabharata describes the Brahmastra, a weapon so powerful that it can destroy entire armies, boil the oceans, and darken the sun. When deployed, it produces a column of smoke and fire that rises to touch the heavens. The ground shakes, water evaporates, and those caught in its range are reduced to ash so fine that their bodies cannot be identified. This sounds less like mythology and more like nuclear weapons, or impact events, or directed energy on a scale that makes modern technology look primitive. The Greek myths speak of Zeus wielding thunderbolts, forged by the Cyclops, one-eyed giants who worked in the depths of the earth. These thunderbolts could shatter mountains, boil seas, and bring down the sky itself. When Zeus used them to defeat the Titans, the world itself trembled. Every culture that remembers the flood also remembers weapons, celestial weapons, divine technology, forces that could reshape the planet. And every description, when stripped of theological language, sounds like impact events. Someone knew a comet was fragmenting. Someone had the capability to track its trajectory. And someone either redirected those fragments toward the ice sheets, or allowed them to strike knowing what would happen. Knowing that the ice would melt. Knowing that the seas would rise. Knowing that coastal civilizations would drown. This was not punishment in the moral sense. This was extermination in the practical sense. And it was precise. Because notice what survived. Highland cultures, inland settlements, mountain communities, people who lived far from the coasts, far from the flood zones, far from the areas that would be inundated when 400 feet of seawater redrew the maps. The reset targeted coastal civilization specifically. It targeted the places where advanced cultures would most likely develop, where trade routes converged, where fishing provided stable food supplies, where boats enabled long-distance communication, where the ocean itself served as a highway connecting distant peoples into networks of shared knowledge. Drown the coasts and you erase the infrastructure of global civilization. You fragment humanity back into isolated inland pockets. You force survivors to start over in environments less conducive to rapid development. You reset the conditions that allowed advancement in the first place. But here is where the mechanism reveals something even stranger. The flood did not come all at once. The geological record shows multiple pulses, initial impacts triggering immediate melt. Then secondary effects as destabilized ice sheets continued collapsing for centuries. Then slower sea level rise as thermal expansion and continued glacial retreat added water volume over millennia. This was not a single 40-day event, despite what Genesis claims. This was a process, a cascade, an unfolding catastrophe that took generations to fully manifest, which means the warning given to Ziusudra, to Atrahasis, to know, was not 40 days' notice, it was decades, possibly centuries, time enough to see the pattern, time enough to understand what was coming, time enough to build a boat and gather what needed to be preserved. Someone with knowledge of celestial mechanics could have calculated when the fragments would strike. Someone with understanding of glaciology could have predicted the melt rate. Someone with maps of pre-impact coastlines could have identified which areas would flood and which would remain above water. And someone who wanted humanity to survive, but in reduced form, could have used that knowledge to save a remnant. Not everyone, not the Nephilim who were concentrated in the lowland cities, not the hybrid bloodlines who ruled the coastal empires, not the accumulated technology and knowledge that made pre-flood humanity a threat, just the seed, the basic human stock, the genetic material necessary to restart the species, guided to safety, given instructions, taught to remember the flood as punishment so they would fear it happening again. The reset was not natural disaster, it was engineered catastrophe. The comet provided the mechanism, the ice sheets provided the water, the coastal geography provided the targeting system, and the divine council, or whoever they were, provided the intent. They pressed the button, the planet reset, and when the waters finally receded, when the survivors emerged from their boats and their mountain refuges and looked down at a world made unrecognizable by risen seas and drowned cities, they were exactly what the reset had intended them to be: smaller, scattered, traumatized, and completely dependent on the knowledge that someone, somewhere had chosen to preserve. The mechanism was perfect. It used natural forces to accomplish unnatural goals. It left no evidence of artificial intervention because the intervention was simply allowing nature to take its catastrophic course. And it ensured that survivors would interpret the event not as technology but as theology, not as engineering but as judgment. The flood was not punishment. It was the most sophisticated weapon ever deployed, precise, devastating, and disguised as the wrath of God. PAC-4 tree. TER coal, PAK-TE BP2 5 and worse. The flood, it was a reset, then the ark was the recovery drive, the backup protocol, the contingency that ensures the system can restart even after catastrophic failure. And every culture that remembers the flood also remembers the warning, the instructions, the exception carved into the code of total erasure. Someone broke ranks. This is the detail that appears everywhere, in every version of the flood story, across every culture that preserved the memory. A divine being, a god, a celestial messenger, someone with access to the decision and knowledge of the timeline, violated protocol and warned a human, not humanity as a whole, not a public announcement giving everyone equal chance to prepare. One man, one family, chosen for reasons the texts struggle to explain but always insist were essential. In the Sumerian version it was Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, who could not bear to see knowledge perish entirely. The divine council had decreed silence, no warnings. Let humanity face the flood unaware, so resistance would be impossible and survival would be left to chance. But Enki went to the reed hut where Ziusudra lived and whispered through the wall. Not directly, the text specifies, but through the barrier, as though even the act of warning had to maintain plausible deniability. Reed hut, wall, wall, hear me and pay attention. A flood will sweep over the cities and the seed of mankind will be destroyed. Build a boat, abandon riches and seek life. Despise property and preserve the soul alive. The instructions were specific: dimensions for the boat, materials for the hull, bitumen for sealing, how to reinforce the structure, how to calculate the weight distribution, how to create ventilation without compromising integrity. This was not vague spiritual guidance. This was engineering documentation transmitted verbally because writing, though it existed, could be discovered. In the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the same scene plays out with even more technical detail. Enki addresses not Atrahasis directly but his reed house, speaking to the structure itself so that technically he is not disobeying the council's command to remain silent. The boat specifications are precise. Roof it over like the Apsu, the underground freshwater abyss, make the boat's construction equal in all dimensions. The language is mathematical, geometric. The vocabulary of someone who understands structural engineering and is trying to compress that understanding into verbal instructions, simple enough to remember but detailed enough to work. And then comes the strangest instruction of all: take on board the seed of all living things, not animals alone. Seed. The word appears in every version. Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Sanskrit, Greek, different languages but the same concept. Seed, genetic material, the biological code necessary for restarting life after the reset. In Genesis, this becomes two of every kind, male and female, to preserve reproductive pairings. But the earlier Mesopotamian versions are more specific. Atrahasis is told to bring craftsmen, musicians, scribes, not just animals but culture bearers, people who carry knowledge in their skills, in their hands, in their ability to recreate what civilization had built. The boat was not just preserving biology, it was preserving information. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes Manu gathering the 7 great sages, the Sapta Rishis, along with seeds of all plants and representatives of all species. But the emphasis is on the sages. These are not random holy men. They are repositories of the Vedas, the sacred knowledge that predates written text. They carry in memory the mathematical formulas, the astronomical observations, the medicinal recipes, the architectural principles that would otherwise be lost. They are living hard drives, encoded with pre-flood knowledge. Why save knowledge if the goal was to reset humanity to a more primitive state? This is the question that breaks the punishment narrative completely. If the flood was divine judgment against wickedness, if the purpose was to cleanse the earth and start fresh with only the righteous surviving, why preserve technology? Why save the texts? Why include craftsmen and scholars, and people whose entire value lies in what they know rather than their moral character? The answer becomes clear only when we stop reading the flood as punishment and start reading it as system maintenance. The reset was not about morality, it was about control. Humanity had advanced too far too fast. The Nephilim hybrids had created a genetic contamination problem. The population had exploded beyond manageable levels. And most dangerous of all, humans had begun to develop independently, creating their own knowledge rather than receiving it from divine sources. But completely erasing humanity would be waste. The biological experiment, whatever its flaws, had produced something valuable: intelligence, adaptability, the capacity for civilization. These traits were worth preserving. They just needed to be reset to an earlier developmental stage, stripped of the infrastructure that made them dangerous, and restarted under closer supervision. So the Ark Protocol was not about saving the righteous. It was about preserving the viable human genetic stock while eliminating the problematic elements. The Nephilim, concentrated in the lowland cities, would drown, the hybrid bloodlines would be cut off, the accumulated technology would be destroyed. But the baseline human genome, uncontaminated by divine genetics, would survive in sufficient numbers to repopulate. And with them, carefully selected knowledge. Not everything, not the weapons technology, not the advanced mathematics that enabled prediction of celestial events, not the organizational structures that allowed cities to coordinate across vast distances, but enough to prevent humanity from dropping all the way back to the Stone Age, enough to ensure the post-flood world could eventually rebuild to a level that was useful but not threatening. This is why every flood narrative includes specific items saved on the Ark that have nothing to do with survival. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim brings aboard not just his family and animals but also silver and gold, precious materials that have no survival value in a drowned world but represent stored wealth and the concept of value itself. He brings craftsmen skilled in working metal and wood, people whose knowledge will be essential for rebuilding but who require tools and infrastructure to practice their crafts. The Sumerian version mentions tablets, clay tablets inscribed with knowledge, sealed in bitumen to protect them from water, carefully stored in the boat's interior. What was written on these tablets? We do not know because they were not preserved in the archaeological record. But the texts insist they existed. They were considered important enough to take up valuable cargo space. And after the flood, when civilization began to rebuild, it did so with suspicious speed, as though working from instructions rather than improvising from scratch. Consider what happens in the centuries after the flood according to the timeline the texts provide. Humanity emerges from the Ark. The waters recede. Survivors scatter. And within a few generations, cities are being built again, not crude villages. Cities, with irrigation systems, with astronomical observations, with writing systems that appear fully formed, not gradually developed, with legal codes complex enough to handle property disputes, inheritance rights, and commercial contracts. This is not how civilization develops naturally. This is how civilization develops when someone has blueprints. When someone preserved the instruction manual. When someone made sure that essential knowledge survived the reset, even if most of the physical infrastructure did not. The Ark was a data preservation protocol disguised as a rescue mission. And the man chosen to build it was not chosen for righteousness. He was chosen for genetics. Look closely at how the texts describe the flood survivors. Zusudra is called faithful, but also perfect in his generations. Atrahasis is described as wise but also as having pure lineage. Noah in Genesis is righteous in his generations, a phrase that makes no sense if it is referring to moral character, but perfect sense if it is referring to genetic purity. He was uncontaminated. His bloodline had not mixed with the Nephilim. His children carried baseline human DNA without divine admixture. This is what was being preserved, not virtue. Genomes. The reset required eliminating hybrid contamination while saving the original human template. And that template, according to the texts, was becoming rare. The Nephilim had been breeding with human women for generations. Genesis states this explicitly. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives from among them. The result was the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, men of renown. And their presence was spreading. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopian Christianity though excluded from most biblical canons, provides the fullest account. 200 watchers, divine beings assigned to observe humanity, descended to Mount Hermon. They made a pact, binding themselves with mutual oaths because they knew what they were about to do violated their mission parameters. They took human wives. They taught forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught weapon making. Shemioza taught enchantments. Armoros taught counter spells. Barakal taught astrology. Each watcher transmitted a piece of divine knowledge that humans were not supposed to possess. And the offspring of these unions were not simply larger humans. They were different. The text describes them as 3,000 cubits tall, obvious exaggeration but indicating massive size. They consumed the food supplies of entire regions. They began to devour humans when food ran out. They taught violence. They created oppression. And most critically, they were sterile. Or rather, their bloodlines were unstable, producing genetic chaos with each generation. This was the contamination the reset was designed to eliminate. Not moral corruption, though that existed. Genetic corruption. The blurring of the species boundary between human and divine, and the Ark Protocol specifically excluded them. No Nephilim on board, no hybrid bloodlines. Only pure human stock, only those whose DNA matched the original design parameters. The flood would kill the Nephilim because they lived in the lowland cities, the centers of power and wealth built on the coasts and river deltas that would be first to flood. They were concentrated, they were exposed, and when the waters came, their size and strength would not save them. They would drown like everyone else. But the humans chosen for the Ark lived inland. Shurapak, where Zusudra ruled, was not a coastal metropolis. It was an interior city positioned above the initial flood zone. Close enough to water for boat launching but high enough to see the waters coming and have time to prepare. The geographic selection was part of the protocol. Save those positioned to survive. Let natural selection eliminate those positioned to drown. 75 years. That is how long Genesis says it took Noah to build the ark from the time of the warning to the start of the flood. Not 40 days. 75 years. Nearly a human lifetime. Why so long? Because the ark was not just a boat, it was an archive, a genetic bank, a knowledge repository, a complete civilization restart kit that required decades to assemble properly. Cuneiform tablets had to be copied, the most essential knowledge transcribed and sealed. Seeds had to be collected from across regions. Representative samples of every crop species that would be needed for post-flood agriculture. Animals had to be selected, not random pairs but breeding stock, young and healthy, capable of producing multiple generations. Craftsmen had to be recruited and convinced to abandon their homes, to trust that the flood was coming, to spend years preparing for a catastrophe their neighbors mocked as delusion. And the ark itself had to be built to specifications that would let it survive not just water but violence. Because when the floods began, when people realized too late that the warnings had been true, they would try to board by force. The boat had to be sealable, defendable, strong enough to resist ramming and attacks from those left outside. The texts hint at this violence, though they do not dwell on it. As the waters rose, those who had mocked now begged, those who had ignored now believed. But it was too late. The ark was sealed, the protocol was engaged, and the reset proceeded with the cold efficiency of a system executing its programmed function. When the rain finally stopped, when the waters began to recede, when the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat or Nizza, or whatever highland peak marked the new coastline, those who emerged were not survivors of divine wrath. They were the selected seed, the backup copy, the restore point from which humanity would restart, smaller, simpler, traumatized enough to obey, but viable enough to rebuild. The ark was not mercy. It was preservation of assets. The flood was not punishment, it was pruning. And the survivors were not the righteous spared by grace. They were the chosen carriers of genetic and informational data deemed worth recovering after the reset. And every single one of them would spend the rest of their lives telling their children, Do not forget. Do not forget what happens when humanity reaches too high. Do not forget the flood. Do not forget that the gods can erase everything. Remember, obey, fear. The reset was not designed to destroy memory. It was designed to create a specific memory. A memory of terror, of divine power, of the cost of exceeding boundaries. A memory that would function as a control mechanism for millennia to come, keeping post-flood humanity from ever again attempting what their ancestors had achieved before the waters swept over and the old world drowned. If the flood was real, the earth remembers. Rock does not lie. Sediment does not fabricate. And when you dig deep enough, when you peel back the layers of time compressed into soil, you find the boundary. The line that separates the world before from the world after. A scar in the planet's skin that circles the globe and whispers the same message everywhere. Something happened. Something sudden. Something so violent that its signature is still readable 12,000 years later. They call it the Younger Dryas boundary layer. And it should not exist. The end of the last ice age was supposed to be gradual. A slow warming trend as Earth's orbit shifted and solar radiation increased. Glaciers retreating incrementally over thousands of years. Sea levels rising steadily but predictably. Climate zones migrating northward as the ice released its grip on the continents. This is what the models predicted. This is what gradualist geology required. But the rock tells a different story. At archaeological sites across North America, from Pennsylvania to Arizona, from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest, excavators found something that defied the gradualist narrative. A thin layer of sediment, rarely more than a few inches thick, darker than the soil above and below it. At first, they thought it was a simple fire layer, evidence of widespread burning from natural wildfires or human activity. But when they analyzed the material in laboratories, when they placed samples under electron microscopes and subjected them to mass spectrometry, they realized they were looking at something far stranger. The layer contained nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals of pure carbon formed under pressure and temperature conditions that do not occur naturally on Earth's surface. Diamonds require either the sustained compression found deep in the planet's mantle or the instantaneous shock pressure of cosmic impact. These were shock diamonds, impact diamonds, the signature of something from space striking with enough force to convert carbon into its crystalline form in a fraction of a second. There were magnetic spherules, tiny beads of iron and other metals melted at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, then cooled so rapidly they froze into perfect spheres before they could deform. These form an impact plume. In the superheated ejector thrown into the atmosphere, when a projectile moving at tens of thousands of miles per hour converts its kinetic energy into thermal energy against solid ground. There was platinum, not scattered randomly, but concentrated in a spike 300 times higher than background levels. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust but common in certain types of asteroids and comets. When a platinum-rich impactor strikes, it disperses that platinum across the impact zone in concentrations that can be detected millions of years later. There were carbon spherules, microscopic balls of vitrified organic matter. This is what happens when biomass, plants and animals and soil rich in carbon, is subjected to temperatures so intense that the organic compounds do not simply burn but melt and fuse into glass, like particles before combustion can complete. And most damning of all, there was the distribution. This layer did not appear at a single site. It appeared at dozens of sites, hundreds of sites, across an entire hemisphere, always at the same depth in the stratigraphic column, always dated to the same narrow window of time, 12,800 years before present, plus or minus a few decades. This is not the signature of wildfires. This is not the signature of volcanic eruptions, though some have tried to make that argument. This is the signature of multiple extraterrestrial impacts occurring simultaneously or within a very short time frame. A fragmented comet, a swarm of debris, a celestial shotgun blast that hit the northern hemisphere in a cascade of explosions. And it hit exactly where it would cause maximum flooding. The Laurentide ice sheet, covering Canada and the northern United States. The Cordilleran ice sheet, blanketing the Pacific Northwest. The Scandinavian ice sheet, stretching across northern Europe. These were not random targets. These were the largest reservoirs of frozen water on the planet, 2 miles thick in places, containing enough ice to raise global sea levels by hundreds of feet if they melted. The impacts did not melt the ice gradually, they vaporized portions of it instantly. The energy release from multiple impacts would have been equivalent to millions of megatons, dwarfing every nuclear weapon ever built combined. The ice sheets did not drip. They exploded, shattered, collapsed, sent torrents of meltwater flooding across landscapes in waves that carved bedrock. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington state bear witness to this violence. A landscape that looks alien wrong, impossible under normal geological processes. Giant ripple marks like the ripples you see in sand at the beach but scaled up to the size of buildings. Dry waterfalls hundreds of feet tall, carved not by thousands of years of gradual erosion, but by a few days of water moving with such volume and velocity that it stripped away everything in its path. Coulees and canyons that could only have been carved by floods of biblical proportion. Geologists call this the Missoula floods, massive outburst flooding from glacial Lake Missoula. But Lake Missoula was just one source. The entire ice sheet was destabilizing, and the water had nowhere to go but down, into the valleys, into the rivers, into the ocean, raising sea level in pulses that geologists can measure in ice cores and coral reefs and submerged coastlines. Meltwater pulse way. The name is clinical, almost boring. It sounds like a technical footnote in a textbook, but what it represents is catastrophic. A rise in global sea level of between 40 and 60 feet occurring over just a few centuries. Some researchers argue it happened even faster, over decades rather than centuries, a rate of rise so extreme that coastal communities would have watched the ocean advance visibly, year by year, generation by generation, swallowing everything. If you lived on the coast 12,000 years ago, you did not have to believe in divine punishment. You could watch the water rising. You could measure it against the stones you marked in your childhood. You could see the tide line moving inland, relentless, unstoppable, indifferent to prayer or sacrifice or any human to negotiate with the forces that were remaking the world. And the coast was where civilization lived, not inland. Not in the mountains, the coast, where fishing provided reliable protein, where shellfish could be harvested year-round, where trade routes connected distant communities by boat, faster and more efficient than overland travel, where rivers met the sea and created rich estuarine environments that supported dense populations. The Ice Age coastlines are gone now, drowned beneath 300 to 400 feet of water. The continental shelves that were dry land are now submerged, covered by sediment, invisible to anyone who does not have sonar and submersible technology. But when you map the ancient coastlines, when you model where sea level was during the Ice Age, you realize how much land was lost. How many places that would have been ideal for human settlement vanished beneath the waves. Doggerland, the landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe, was the size of modern England, fertile, temperate, crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. Archaeological evidence suggests substantial human presence, perhaps even permanent settlements. When the ice melted, Doggerland drowned, slowly at first, then catastrophically as the final ice dams broke and the North Sea filled. Britain became an island not through tectonic drift but through flood. Sunderland, the exposed shelf of Southeast Asia during the Ice Age, was larger than India. It connected what are now Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines into a single continuous landmass. Climate models suggest it was tropical, heavily forested, rich in resources. If advanced human cultures existed anywhere during the Ice Age, Sunderland would have been prime territory. When the seas rose, an area the size of a continent vanished underwater. The Persian Gulf was dry land during the Ice Age. The Gulf as we know it did not exist. Instead, there was a river valley, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, joining into a single channel that flowed south through what is now underwater and emptied into the Indian Ocean far beyond the current coastline. If Sumerian civilization remembered cities older than the ones we have excavated, if their king lists described rulers before the flood, those cities might be at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, buried under 300 feet of water and 70 feet of sediment. This is the great archaeological blind spot. We excavate tells and ruins and ancient cities, but we excavate them where they are now, on modern dry land. We assume that ancient humans lived where we live, built where we build. But if the most advanced Ice Age cultures were coastal, if they built on river deltas and estuaries and shorelines that are now far offshore and deep underwater, then we are looking in the wrong place. We are excavating the equivalent of rural outposts while the cities, the centers of culture and trade and knowledge, lie submerged and invisible. Underwater archaeology has begun to change this. Sonar mapping of coastal shelves has revealed anomalies, straight angles, rhymetric patterns, features that look artificial, that suggest construction that do not fit the random chaos of natural geology. Some of these finds are controversial, some are disputed, but some are undeniable. Dwarka, off the coast of India, submerged ruins of stone structures dated to 9,000 years ago, far older than any civilization that is supposed to have existed in the region. Sonar shows walls, streets, what appear to be building foundations, all resting on the seabed at depths that correspond to sea levels from the end of the Ice Age. Yonaguni, off the southern coast of Japan, a massive underwater formation with features that include terraces, steps, flat platforms, and carved angles. Some geologists insist it is natural, a product of erosion and tectonic fracturing. Others see tool marks, right angles too precise to be accidental, a structure that was built above water and then drowned when the seas rose. The Bimini Road, off the coast of the Bahamas, a linear arrangement of stones that some researchers argue is a harbor wall or road constructed when the area was dry land. Carbon dating of organisms living on the stones suggests they have been submerged for at least 12,000 years. These findings are fragmentary, controversial, dismissed by mainstream archaeology as natural formations misinterpreted by enthusiasts. But the pattern persists. Anomalies keep appearing on coastal shelves at depths corresponding to Ice Age sea levels. Straight lines where there should be random curves. Geometric patterns where there should be chaos. As if something built by intelligence was drowned when the water came and has been waiting ever since, silent and patient, for technology to advance enough to see it again. And then there is the local flood evidence, the layers found in Mesopotamia itself. When Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur in the 1920s, he dug down through occupation layers, through pottery and tools and the accumulated debris of civilization, expecting to reach virgin soil. Instead, his excavators hit something strange: clean clay, sterile, no artifacts, no charcoal, no evidence of human presence, 8 feet of it, sometimes more, separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. Woolley called it flood deposit. Water, laid sediment, deposited rapidly when the city was inundated, and it was not unique to Ur. At Shurapak, the city where the Sumerian flood hero Zu-Sudra was said to have ruled, excavators found the same thing, a thick layer of alluvial clay dividing the archaeological sequence. At Kish, another major Sumerian city, the pattern repeated. Flood layer, sterile silt, evidence of sudden overwhelming water. The dating varies slightly between sites, but clusters around 2 periods. A major flood around 900 BCE, significant but local, possibly the inundation event that entered Sumerian cultural memory. And beneath that, hints of something older, deeper, harder to date precisely, but occurring in the window between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, the exact time frame when the Ice Age was ending and sea levels were rising globally. Was this the Great Flood, the Reset? Or was it one of many floods, regional catastrophes that echoed a larger global disaster? The archaeology cannot answer definitively, but it confirms the essential claim: the Sumerians did not invent the flood myth. They documented the flood reality. Water came, cities drowned, civilization was disrupted, and the survivors remembered. The geological evidence does not prove divine intervention. It does not prove the Anunnaki pressed a reset button or that the flood was anything other than natural climate catastrophe. But it proves the flood happened. Proves it was sudden. Proves it was catastrophic. Proves that exactly when the ancient texts say the world was reset, the planet was undergoing the most violent environmental transition in human history. And it proves that the survivors of that transition had every reason to believe they had lived through the end of the world. Because for them, in their experience, confined to the coastlines and river valleys, they knew the world did end. The land drowned. The people died. The cities vanished. And those who remained were left to build again on higher ground, with nothing but memory and whatever knowledge they had managed to save. The reset layer is real. It circles the planet. And everywhere it appears, it tells the same story. Before this line, one world. After this line, another. And in between, water, fire. And the systematic erasure of everything coastal humanity had built during the thousands of years when the ice held the sea at bay and the shores were safe. The earth remembers. And the memory is written in sediment, in nanodiamonds, in platinum spikes, in drowned coastlines and flood deposits, and a boundary layer that should not exist if history unfolded the way we have been taught. Something reset the world 12,000 years ago. The question is not whether it happened. The question is whether it happened naturally, or whether someone somewhere knew exactly what pressing that button would do. When the waters receded and the survivors emerged, they did not start from zero. This is the detail that breaks the conventional timeline of human civilization, because the archaeological record shows something impossible: cultures appearing fully formed, knowledge manifesting without developmental stages, mathematics and astronomy and architecture and writing systems that should require centuries of trial and error arriving complete, as though copied from an older source rather than invented through experimentation. The Sumerians are the most obvious example. Around 3500 BCE, seemingly overnight in archaeological terms, cities appear across southern Mesopotamia. Not villages gradually growing into towns, cities. Uruk with its defensive walls stretching 6 miles. Eridu with its temple complex rebuilt on the same sacred ground for millennia. Nippur with its astronomical observatories and scribal schools, each one geometrically planned, astronomically aligned, engineered with sophistication that suggests institutional knowledge rather than fumbling discovery. And with those cities came a knowledge package that should not exist yet. Base 60 mathematics, the sexagesimal system that we still use today when we count 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This is not an obvious system. Most cultures count in tens, matching the number of fingers. Some count in 20s, including toes. But 60 requires recognizing that this number has more divisors than any smaller number, making it ideal for astronomy, geometry, and trade calculations. It requires abstract mathematical thinking. And the Sumerians had it from the beginning, with no earlier base 10 or base 12 developmental phase visible in the archaeological record. They had astronomical knowledge that required generations of continuous observation. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, copying even older Sumerian sources, record the synodic period of Venus with perfect accuracy. 584 days, the time it takes Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun. To know this, you must track Venus meticulously across multiple cycles, note the pattern, calculate the average, and verify the result over decades. The Sumerians did not discover this, they knew it, as if they were consulting records compiled by earlier astronomers who had already done the work. They had medical knowledge that actually works. Tablets from Nippur list pharmaceutical remedies using combinations of plants, minerals, and animal products. Time for respiratory infections. Willow bark containing salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin for pain and fever. Fermented barley mixtures for digestive ailments. These remedies are not superstition. Modern pharmacology confirms they contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes. Someone had already tested these combinations. Someone had already determined dosages. Someone had already compiled the data, and the Sumerians inherited it. They had legal codes of stunning sophistication. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to around 2100 BCE but referencing older legal traditions, distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm. It specifies compensation rates for different types of injuries. It includes appeal processes. It recognizes property rights, inheritance laws, and contract enforcement. Legal systems. This nuance developed through centuries of case law, where real disputes reveal gaps in existing codes and force refinement. But Sumerian law appears comprehensive from its earliest attestations, as though working from a template. And they had writing, not pictographs slowly evolving into abstract symbols over generations. Cuneiform. Fully formed. 700 distinct signs in its earliest known form, capable of recording poetry, legal contracts, astronomical observations, and medical texts with equal precision. The writing system appeared so suddenly that scholars still argue about whether it was invented in Mesopotamia or imported from somewhere else. But imported from where? There is no earlier literate culture visible in the archaeological record. Unless that culture drowned, this pattern, advanced knowledge appearing without developmental stages, repeats across the ancient world. In Egypt, hieroglyphic writing and monumental architecture appear together around 200 BCE. Before that, scattered Neolithic villages. After that, suddenly pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BCE, is not a primitive experiment. It is the culmination. Its alignment to true north is accurate to within 3/60 of a single degree, more precise than most modern buildings. Its internal passages align with stellar positions that required sophisticated astronomical knowledge to calculate. And its dimensions encode mathematical constants, pi and phi, that Egyptian mathematics supposedly could not yet express. The pyramid is not evidence of Egypt learning to build. It is evidence of Egypt remembering how to build. The older temples beneath the pyramid, temples that Egyptologists date to earlier periods, show similar precision, as though Egyptian civilization inherited architectural knowledge and was executing it rather than developing it. The Sphinx compounds this mystery. Geologists examining the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls have identified deep vertical fissures carved by heavy, sustained rainfall. The kind of rainfall that has not occurred in Egypt since the African humid period ended around 7000 to 5000 BCE, thousands of years before the pharaohs. If the Sphinx was carved when that rainfall was still occurring, it predates Egyptian dynastic civilization by millennia. It would be an inheritance from an earlier culture, later claimed and restored by the Egyptians who found it already ancient, already eroded, already mysterious. In the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro appear around 2600 BCE with urban planning that rivals anything built in the next 4000 years. Grid layouts, standardized brick sizes, sophisticated drainage systems with covered sewers, public baths with waterproofing technology, and like Sumer in Egypt, writing that appears suddenly, fully formed with no visible developmental phase. The Indus script remains undeciphered, but its existence proves that whoever built these cities possessed literacy, mathematics, and engineering knowledge that should have required centuries to accumulate. Across the ancient world, the pattern holds: knowledge appearing too early, sophistication manifesting too quickly, as though multiple cultures, separated by geography but connected by time, were all working from the same inherited source, all rebuilding from the same fragmented blueprint, all remembering what had been lost when the waters came. But knowledge is not only found in cities and tablets, it is written into genetics, into the biological code that every human carries. And when scientists began mapping the human genome, when they traced mitochondrial DNA back through maternal lineages and Y chromosomal DNA through paternal lineages, they found something strange: bottlenecks. Points where genetic diversity collapsed dramatically, where the population shrank to a tiny remnant before expanding again. Mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common maternal ancestor of all living humans, existed around 200,000 years ago. Not because she was the only woman alive, but because her mitochondrial line is the only one that survived to the present. Every other maternal lineage from that era went extinct. This suggests a population bottleneck, a near-extinction event where most human genetic diversity was lost. Y chromosomal Adam, the most recent common paternal ancestor, existed around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Again, not the only man, but the only paternal lineage that survived. Again, a bottleneck. And then, around 70,000 years ago, another bottleneck: the Toba supervolcano eruption, the largest volcanic event in the past 2 million years, threw so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that global temperatures plummeted. Genetic evidence suggests the human population crashed to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. We nearly went extinct. The entire current human population descends from that tiny remnant. And then, another bottleneck around 12,000 years ago. Less severe than Toba, but significant. Genetic diversity drops, population contracts, and then expands again rapidly in the millennia that follow. The timing corresponds exactly to the Younger Dryas impacts, to the flood, to the genetics confirm what the myths describe. Humanity was reduced, not to a single family. The Noah story is symbolic compression, but to scattered remnants. Small populations surviving in highland refuges, inland settlements, places the flood could not reach. And from those remnants, modern humanity descended. But genetics reveals something else. Something that researchers struggle to explain within the conventional narrative of human evolution. There are genetic signatures in modern humans that do not match any known ancestral population. Admixtures with archaic hominins, yes. Neanderthal DNA in Europeans and Asians. Denisovan DNA in Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. But also unexplained components. Genetic material that appears to have come from an unknown source. A ghost population that contributed to the human genome but left no fossil record, no archaeological trace, no clear origin. Some researchers speculate this represents interbreeding with an unidentified archaic hominin species that went extinct before leaving fossil evidence. But another interpretation, one that aligns disturbingly well with the ancient texts, is that this represents the genetic legacy of the Nephilim, the hybrids. The offspring of the Watchers and human women. If those beings existed, if they interbred with humans for generations before the flood, their genetic contribution would persist. Diluted over thousands of years of human breeding, but present, detectable. A genetic memory of something that should not have been possible. Ra-negative blood is another anomaly. Most humans are Ra positive, carrying a protein on their red blood cells that is shared with rhesus monkeys, suggesting common ancestry. But 15% of humans, concentrated in certain populations, are Rho negative. They lack this protein entirely. This is not a loss mutation where a functional gene is damaged. This is an absence, as though Ra negative humans descended from a lineage that never had the protein to begin with. A lineage that did not evolve from the same primate ancestors. Where did Ra negative blood come from? Conventional genetics has no clear answer. It exists. It is inherited. It causes complications in pregnancy when Rho negative mothers carry Ra positive babies, as if the two blood types are incompatible at a fundamental level, as if they come from different biological origins. The ancient texts describe hybrid offspring whose biology was unstable, whose bloodlines caused problems, whose genetics did not mix cleanly with baseline human stock. Ra negative blood may be the last persistent echo of that mixing. The inheritance humanity received from the pre-flood world was not only cultural and technological, it was biological. We carry in ourselves the memory of genetic experiments, of hybridization events, of population crashes and recoveries that shape not just our history but our DNA itself. And we carry something else. Junk DNA. 98% of the human genome that does not code for proteins, that serves no obvious function, that appears to be evolutionary baggage accumulated over millions of years. Except that recent research has begun discovering that some of this junk DNA is not junk at all. It contains regulatory sequences, activation codes, dormant instructions that can be triggered under certain conditions. What if some of that non-coding DNA is not evolutionary residue, but pre-flood legacy? Instructions left dormant, waiting for the right conditions to activate. Knowledge encoded not in clay tablets but in chromosomes, abilities that humanity once possessed. Lost during the reset when populations crashed and genetic diversity collapsed, but still present in latent form, waiting. This is speculation. But it is speculation grounded in the reality that we do not understand why humans possess the genome we do. We do not understand why our brains are 3 times larger than they should be for a primate of our body size. We do not understand why we possess language capabilities far exceeding what survival requires. We do not understand why we can do abstract mathematics, create symbolic art, contemplate our own existence, abilities that provide no clear evolutionary advantage but exist nonetheless, unless we were designed, unless we were engineered, unless the Atrahasis epic is not mythology but documentation, clay mixed with divine essence, biology combined with something else, a creation event that produced beings capable of more than their creators initially intended, beings who inherited not just the capacity for civilization but the seeds of transcendence. The reset was supposed to erase that potential, strip humanity back to manageable levels, eliminate the hybrids, drown the knowledge, scatter the survivors so they could never again coordinate on a global scale. But the reset could not erase everything. Knowledge persisted in memory, genetic potential persisted in DNA, and the survivors, traumatized but determined, began the long work of rebuilding. They did not start from scratch, they started from fragments. And those fragments, carefully preserved on arks and in highland refuges, carried forward by people who remembered, became the foundation of what we call the birth of civilization. The Sumerians rebuilding with inherited mathematics, the Egyptians constructing with inherited architecture, the Indus Valley cities planning with inherited engineering. Not invention, not discovery remembrance, not the first civilization, the second, or perhaps the third, or the 10th. Because if resets are periodic, if the cycle repeats every 12,000 years, every 26,000 years, every time humanity reaches a threshold that threatens divine control, then what we call ancient history might be only the most recent iteration. And we, standing here now with our satellites and genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, might be approaching another threshold, another moment when creation surpasses creator, another point where the cosmic reset button becomes viable. The inheritance we received from the pre-flood world was not just knowledge and genetics, it was a warning, a memory encoded in flood myths and king lists and geological scars, a testimony that resets happen, that world's end, that survival requires preparation, and that whatever we build, however sophisticated it becomes, can be erased in a single generation if we forget that we are not the first to reach this high. The clay tablets whisper this, the DNA confirms it, and the drowned coastlines, silent beneath 300 feet of water, hold the physical proof. We are the inheritors, the descendants of survivors, the children of the reset, and the question that haunts every artifact, every genetic anomaly, every piece of knowledge that appears too early in our timeline is this: what else did we inherit that we have not yet remembered? The survivors emerged from scattered refuges speaking the same language. This is the detail buried in nearly every flood narrative, mentioned briefly before the story moves forward but never fully explained. Before the scattering there was unity, one tongue, one speech, one way of organizing thought into sound that every human understood regardless of geography or lineage. Genesis preserves this memory in a single verse, almost as an aside. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, past tense had, as though the writer is acknowledging something that existed before but no longer does, something lost. And then, a few verses later, the loss is explained, not as natural linguistic drift, not as populations separating and dialects diverging over millennia, but as a single catastrophic event. Sudden, deliberate, imposed from above, the Tower of Babel. The story is so familiar it has become metaphor, shorthand for ambitious projects that collapse into chaos. But strip away the theological overlay and read it as documentation. Read it as survivors of the flood attempting something specific, something that required coordination, something that would allow them to reach back toward what had been lost. The text says they journeyed east and found a plain in the land of Shinar. Shinar is Sumer. The plain is Mesopotamia. This is not symbolic geography. This is a specific location, the same river valley where the oldest cities would rise, where cuneiform would be pressed into clay, where the Sumerian king list would record impossible rains before the flood swept over. And there, in that plain, they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." Not stone, bricks, fired clay. the signature building material of Mesopotamian civilization. The text is describing the reinvention of ceramic technology, of kilns capable of producing building materials stronger than sun-dried mud. This is not primitive, this is sophisticated, and it appears immediately after the flood, as though the survivors brought the knowledge with them. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." A city, not a village, not a temporary camp, a permanent urban center, and a tower. The Hebrew word is migdal, which can mean tower, fortress, or elevated structure, but in the context of Mesopotamia, in the land where ziggurats would define religious architecture for millennia, the tower is almost certainly a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid, a structure designed not for defense but for connection, a physical link between earth and heaven. The ziggurats were not built to reach heaven through height alone. Even the largest, the Itamananki in Babylon, rose only about 300 feet. Impressive for ancient engineering, but hardly threatening to divine beings supposedly dwelling in celestial realms. The threat was not altitude, the threat was function. Every ziggurat had a small temple at its summit, not for public worship. The masses gathered at ground level. The summit temple was intimate, private, furnished with a bed, a table, offerings of food and drink. It was called the Japa, the waiting chamber, the place where heaven was supposed to descend, where gods would touch earth, where communication between divine and mortal could occur. Before the flood, according to the texts, this communication was constant. The Anunnaki walked among humans, Enki taught in Eridu, Enlil governed from Nippur. The boundary between heaven and earth was permeable. But after the flood, the gods withdrew, the direct contact ceased, and humanity was left with memory of how things had been and desperate desire to restore the connection. The Tower of Babel was not arrogance, it was engineering, an attempt to rebuild the communication infrastructure that the flood had severed, to create a beacon, a landing platform, a physical location where the gods might descend again as they had before, to restore kingship from heaven, because without divine guidance, without access to the knowledge the gods possessed, post-flood humanity was fumbling in darkness. But the text says God, or the gods in the plural depending on translation, came down to see what was being built, and what they saw alarmed them. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Read that again. Nothing will be impossible for them. Not nothing is impossible for us, the gods. Nothing will be impossible for them, humanity, if they remain unified, if they continue speaking one language, if they can coordinate, plan, build together without barriers of communication. This is not a statement about divine power being threatened. This is a statement about human potential being recognized as dangerous. Unified humanity speaking a single language, working toward shared goals, was capable of anything. Capable of rebuilding what the flood had erased. Capable of reaching the technological and organizational level that had existed before the reset. Capable of once again becoming a problem. The solution was elegant and permanent. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech, not destroy the tower, not strike them dead, not send another flood, just introduce confusion, fragment the communication protocols, ensure that humans could no longer coordinate on the scale required for truly ambitious projects, turn the species against itself through the simple barrier of mutual incomprehension. And it worked. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. The project halted, not because of lack of materials or engineering failure, because coordination became impossible, because builders speaking different languages could not communicate specifications, could not relay instructions, could not work together on complex tasks requiring precision and timing. The tower stood unfinished, the city fragmented, and humanity scattered across the earth, carrying with them linguistic seeds that would grow into the language families we recognize today, but never again sharing a common tongue. Linguistic evidence supports a dispersal event, though linguists date it much earlier than the biblical timeline. The major language families, Indo-European, Semitic, Sinote and Niger-Congo, appear to have diverged from earlier proto-languages thousands of years ago. But the divergence is not gradual. It is relatively sudden in evolutionary terms. And it produces language families so different from one another that reconstruction of earlier common ancestors becomes impossible beyond a certain depth. Sumerian stands alone. A linguistic isolate with no known relatives, no family tree, no clear point of origin. It appears in the archaeological record around 3500 BCE, fully formed, already complex, used for everything from poetry to tax receipts, and then it dies, replaced by Akkadian around 2000 BCE, preserved only as a liturgical language, a dead tongue maintained by priests and scribes because it was considered sacred, the language of the gods. What if Sumerian was the original language? The pre-Babel tongue that everyone spoke before the confusion. After the scattering, it survived in one location, Mesopotamia, the place where the tower was being built. But everywhere else, the linguistic fragmentation produced daughter languages that evolved so differently from the parent that their common origin became unrecognizable. This would explain why Sumerian has no relatives. Not because it evolved in isolation, but because it did not evolve at all. It was the baseline, the source code. And everything else diverged from it so dramatically, so quickly under whatever mechanism the confusion employed, that the connections were severed irretrievably. The mechanism of the confusion remains unclear. The text simply says the language was confused. Not that humans forgot how to speak, not that they suddenly became incapable of communication, but that mutual comprehension failed. They could speak. They could not understand one another. In neurological terms, this suggests something affecting the language processing centers of the brain, not global amnesia, selective disruption, an event that left vocabulary intact but scrambled the syntax. The grammar, the deep structure that allows sounds to map onto meaning consistently across speakers. Could such an event occur naturally? Language drift happens over generations, not overnight, but there are documented cases of linguistic isolation producing rapid change. Populations separated by catastrophe, by migration, by geographic barriers, can develop mutually incomprehensible dialects within a few generations if contact ceases. Expand that process. Accelerate it, impose it simultaneously across multiple populations, each developing in a different direction with no shared reference point. And within a few generations, you have language families that appear completely unrelated. But that requires separation. The Babel account describes confusion happening while people were still together, still attempting to build, still physically co-located. For language to fragment that quickly without geographic separation suggests something else: intervention, an imposed change to how human brains process language. Not removing the capacity entirely, but introducing variations, errors, incompatibilities that propagate differently in different populations. Genetic evidence shows that human populations underwent significant mixing and migration in the period between 15,000 and 5,000 BCE. The end of the Ice Age triggered massive population movements as coastlines shifted and climate zones migrated. People who had been isolated for millennia suddenly came into contact. Interturbed exchanged genes and ideas. This mixing should have produced linguistic convergence, not divergence. Populations sharing genetic material tend to share linguistic features. But instead, the language families that emerge from this period are radically different from one another, unless the confusion was not natural, unless it was engineered. A deliberate introduction of linguistic incompatibility to prevent exactly what the text describes: unified human effort toward ambitious goals that would threaten divine control. The consequences were immediate and permanent. Without a common language, large-scale coordination became impossible. Trade required translators. Treaties required negotiation through intermediaries. Technical knowledge could not spread easily because the vocabulary to describe complex concepts differed across languages. What one culture discovered, another could not easily adopt because the linguistic framework for transmitting that knowledge did not exist. Civilizations still rose. Cities were still built. Mathematics and astronomy and writing still developed. But they developed in isolation. Sumerian mathematics in Mesopotamia, Egyptian engineering in the Nile Valley, Indus urbanism in the Indus Valley, Chinese metallurgy in the Yellow River Basin, each culture advancing independently, reinventing solutions to problems that other cultures had already solved, unable to benefit from each other's accumulated knowledge because the linguistic barrier made communication too difficult. This is the hidden cost of Babel. Not the failure to finish one tower, but the fragmentation of human knowledge. The multiplication of effort as each linguistic group had to rediscover independently what could have been shared universally if a common tongue had survived. The loss of coordination that might have allowed post-flood humanity to rebuild quickly, efficiently, to reach in centuries what instead took millennia. And perhaps that was the point. The reset was supposed to set humanity back. But survivors with knowledge, even fragmented knowledge, could rebuild too quickly if they worked together. The language barrier ensured they would not. It was the permanent throttle, the speed limit encoded into human communication itself. Not crippling, not destructive, just limiting, ensuring that any future advancement would be slow, isolated, incapable of reaching the unified global coordination that pre-flood civilization had achieved. The ziggurats still rose across Mesopotamia for thousands of years after Babel, Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, each one a stepped pyramid reaching toward heaven. each one crowned with a summit temple where priests waited, performing rituals, making offerings, calling to gods who no longer answered. The structures became increasingly elaborate, the rituals more complex, the priesthoods more organized, but the gods did not descend, because the communication protocol had been broken, not the physical structures, the linguistic interface. Heaven and earth could no longer understand each other. The language of the gods, whatever it was, Sumerian perhaps, remained unchanged. But human languages fragmented into thousands of mutually incomprehensible tongues, and without a shared language the connection could not be restored. Itamnanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, was the final and grandest attempt. Its name means, house of the foundation of heaven and earth, built and rebuilt across centuries, reaching 300 feet high, visible for miles across the Mesopotamian plain. 7 tiers, each painted a different color, representing the 7 celestial spheres. At the summit, the Jipar, furnished and waiting. Priests ascending daily, chanting in Sumerian, the dead language maintained precisely because it was the language of the gods, the only tongue that might bridge the gap that Babel had created. But the gods never came. The summit temple remained empty. The offerings went uneaten, and gradually, over centuries, the maintenance lapsed, the ziggurat eroded, the city declined, and by the time Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in the 4th century BCE, Itamananki was already a ruin, a massive pile of mud bricks slowly dissolving back into the plain from which it had risen. The failure of Babel was not architectural. The tower could have been finished. The city could have been completed. The failure was linguistic, and that failure was not accident. It was the final safeguard against humanity ever again coordinating on the scale that would threaten those who had pressed the reset button. We still live with the consequences. 7,000 languages spoken today, most of them mutually incomprehensible. Technical knowledge trapped in linguistic silos. Scientific papers written in English that Chinese researchers must translate. Mathematical notation standardized, but the words that explain what the symbols mean still vary. Even now, with global communication technology, with translation software and lingua francas, the language barrier persists. We have built towers again, not of brick, but of steel and glass and digital infrastructure. We coordinate globally. We speak across continents in real time. We have begun to overcome Babel through technology. But the cost of that overcome is that we all speak English or Mandarin, or a handful of dominant languages. The thousands of other tongues, each one carrying unique ways of organizing thought, unique cultural knowledge, unique perspectives on reality, are dying at a rate of 1 every 2 weeks. The confusion is reversing, not by restoring the original language, but by extinguishing diversity until only a few remain. And when that happens, when humanity once again speaks primarily in shared tongues, when coordination becomes effortless and global projects become possible on scales we have not seen since before the flood, the question becomes unavoidable. Will the gods notice? Will the reset mechanism activate again? Or have we finally, after 12,000 years of fragmentation and isolation and slow, painful rebuilding, escaped the cycle that Babel was designed to enforce? The tower stands unfinished in every city on earth. We are still building, still reaching, still trying to restore what was severed when the languages were confused and the communication with heaven went silent. And somewhere, perhaps, the gods are watching, waiting to see if this time we finish what we started, or if once again, at the moment of completion, the button gets pressed and the reset begins. Inu. PAC80. Global YEVR Malware Ramambabas to 400 Birds of the Flood is not a story told in one place by one people. It is a memory that circles the planet. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. From the Himalayas to the Pacific Islands. From the Mediterranean to the Australian outback. Every inhabited continent preserves accounts of the same catastrophe. Waters rising, worlds drowning, small groups surviving, humanity beginning again. The conventional explanation is that floods are common disasters. Every culture experiences flooding at some point, and the trauma gets encoded into mythology. Regional disasters become universal narratives through the natural tendency of storytelling to exaggerate. This explanation sounds reasonable until you examine the details, because these are not vague flood stories. They are the same flood story, told with structural consistency that crosses oceans and millennia. In ancient Sumer, Zeusudra is warned by Enki to build a boat because the gods have decided to destroy humanity with a deluge. He seals the vessel with bitumen, loads it with animals and seeds, and survives 7 days of storms that cover the earth. When the waters recede, he releases birds to find land and makes offerings of thanksgiving. The gods, realizing their mistake, grant him immortality. In Akkadian Babylon, the hero is Utnapishtim. The structure is identical. Divine warning, boat construction, animal preservation, 7-day flood, bird release, sacrifice and reward. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains this account, was written around 1800 BCE. but copies older Sumerian sources by at least 1,000 years. In Hebrew scripture, Noah receives warning from God. He builds an ark to precise specifications. He brings his family and breeding pairs of animals. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters cover even the mountains. He releases a dove, then a raven. When dry land appears, he builds an altar and makes offerings. God establishes a covenant promising never to flood the earth again. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by Matsya, a fish avatar of Vishnu. He builds a boat and ties it to the fish's horn. The fish tows the vessel through the deluge to safety on a mountain peak. When the waters recede, Manu becomes the progenitor of the new human race. The Satapatha Brahmana, which records this story, dates to around 800 BCE but references much older oral traditions. In ancient Greece, Deucalion is warned by his father Prometheus that Zeus plans to flood the earth. He builds a chest, a floating box, and rides out 9 days of rain with his wife Para. They land on Mount Parnassus. After the flood, they repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which become people. The story appears in works by Apollodorus and Ovid, but references earlier traditions now lost. In China, the Great Flood is a foundational myth. Gun attempts to control the waters and fails. His son Yu succeeds by dredging channels and building dams. The flood lasts for generations, transforming the landscape. Yu becomes emperor, founding the Xia dynasty. The story appears in texts dating to around 500 BCE, but describes events traditionally placed around 200 BCE, contemporary with Mesopotamian flood accounts. In Aztec mythology, the fourth sun was destroyed by water. Nahual, for water, the age when the sky rained for 52 years and humanity was transformed into fish. Only one couple, Tata and Nin, survived by hiding in a hollow log. They became the ancestors of the current age, the fifth sun. The Maya tell of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy the wooden people, an imperfect early version of humanity. The Popol Vuh describes torrents from the sky and rising waters that covered the earth. The few who survived became monkeys, lesser beings, while true humans were created afterward from maize. In Inca tradition, the god Viracocha destroyed the first creation with a flood, preserving only 2 people to repopulate the earth. After the deluge, Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca and created the sun, moon, and stars, then fashioned new humans from stone. Among the Ojibwe and other Great Lakes tribes, Nanabozo survives a great flood by floating on a log with animals. He sends animals diving to retrieve mud from beneath the waters. A muskrat succeeds, bringing up soil that Nanabozo uses to recreate the earth. The Hopi describe the destruction of the Third World by water. The faithful were sealed inside hollow reeds and floated to safety while the wicked drowned. When the waters receded, the people emerged into the Fourth World, the current age. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, the Dreamtime stories tell of a great flood that reshaped the land. Variations exist across different language groups, but many describe rising waters that forced people to high ground, with only a few surviving to pass down the knowledge of the time before. These are not isolated myths. They are dozens of accounts preserved independently by cultures that had no contact with one another, separated by oceans they could not cross and thousands of years of linguistic evolution. Yet the core structure repeats: divine warning, water destruction, small group survival, animal preservation, bird reconnaissance, mountain landing, sacrifice or covenant, humanity beginning again. The parallels are too specific for independent invention. Floods are common, yes, but the specific details, the birds, the mountains, the divine warning, the purpose of destroying and restarting rather than simply punishing, repeat across cultures that could not have borrowed from each other. Skeptics argue that flood myths could have spread through ancient trade routes, transmitted from culture to culture until they circled the globe. But Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica had no contact until the 16th century CE. Aboriginal Australia was isolated for over 40,000 years. The Pacific Islands were settled by maritime voyagers who had no connection to Old World civilizations. How did the same story reach them all? The answer that best fits the evidence is that they did not transmit the story to each other. They all experienced the same event. Or more precisely, their ancestors experienced it. And the memory, traumatic and foundational, was preserved through oral tradition until writing could capture it. But this raises the timing problem. Different cultures date their flood myths to different periods. The Sumerian flood is placed around 2900 BCE in the archaeological record, where flood silt appears at Ur and Shurupak. The Chinese flood is traditionally dated to 2200 BCE. The biblical flood is placed variously depending on interpretation, but young Earth creationists date it to around 2300 BCE. These cannot all be the same event if they are separated by centuries, unless the myths are compressing time. Unless what they are remembering is not a single flood in 2900 BCE, but the entire period of catastrophic sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age from 12,000 to 8,000 years ago. When coastlines worldwide drowned under 400 feet of rising water, that period contained multiple pulses of rapid sea level rise. Meltwater pulse LAN around 14,600 years ago, meltwater pulse WMB around 11,300 years ago, and the Younger Dryas impacts around 12,800 years ago that triggered sudden ice sheet collapse and catastrophic flooding. Each pulse would have been experienced as a separate disaster by the populations it affected. Coastal settlements, watching the ocean creep closer year by year, then suddenly surge during a pulse event, drowning river valleys and turning peninsulas into islands overnight. Island communities watching their land shrink, then vanish beneath the waves. River delta civilizations, if they existed, watching the sea intrude inland, salinating fields, flooding cities, forcing retreat to higher ground. If advanced maritime cultures existed on the now submerged continental shelves, the coasts that were dry land during the Ice Age, they would have been completely erased. Their cities drowned, their populations scattered, their knowledge fragmented among the survivors who fled inland and tried to explain to highland peoples what had been lost. Those survivors would carry flood memories, not of one 40-day rain but of generations of rising waters, not of one ark, but of many boats, many migrations, many desperate attempts to preserve what could be saved, and over thousands of years of oral transmission, those memories would compress. Multiple floods becoming one flood, multiple survivors becoming one hero, the complex reality of climate catastrophe simplifying into the archetypal story of divine judgment, survival, and renewal. But the core truth persists. Water came. The old world ended. Humanity survived in small numbers, and everything had to begin again. The geological evidence supports this global memory. Doggerland, the landmass connecting Britain to continental Europe, drowned between 8565 and BCE. It was not empty wilderness. Archaeological surveys have found tools, bones, evidence of human occupation. An entire region the size of England, inhabited, productive, supporting communities of hunter, gatherers or possibly more advanced groups, swallowed by the North Sea as glacial melt raised water levels. Sunderland, the continental shelf of Southeast Asia, was even larger. During the Ice Age, it connected the Malay Peninsula to Borneo, Java and Sumatra, creating a landmass bigger than India. When the seas rose, it vanished almost entirely. If there were cities there, and some researchers believe there were, they are now beneath 300 feet of water, inaccessible, unexplored. Their existence known only through myths and submerged stone structures that sonar occasionally detects. The Persian Gulf was dry land during the Ice Age. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers joined and flowed through a long valley before reaching the ocean. If the Sumerian stories of Eridu being the first city are accurate, and if Eridu's foundations go deeper than currently excavated, the original settlement might have been in that now drowned valley. The flood that destroyed it would not have been 40 days of rain. It would have been the ocean breaking through and inundating the Gulf, turning a river valley into a shallow sea within years or decades. Underwater archaeology is beginning to confirm what the myths describe. Off the coast of India, sonar surveys have detected geometric structures at depths consistent with submersion around 9,000 years ago. Off Japan, the Yonaguni monument shows what appear to be carved terraces, steps, and right-angle formations, though debate continues about whether it is natural or artificial. In the Mediterranean, submerged ruins off the coast of Egypt, Greece, and Turkey suggest coastal settlements that drowned when post-glacial sea levels stabilized. These are not definitive proof of advanced pre-flood civilizations. The evidence is fragmentary, controversial, difficult to study because it sits beneath hundreds of feet of water in areas where diving is challenging and excavation nearly impossible. But the evidence exists, and it aligns with what the myths describe: coastal populations, urban centers, organized societies, drowning when the waters rose. The global memory is not fantasy, it is testimony. Every culture that experienced the trauma preserved it. They encoded it in their origin stories because the flood was their origin. It was the moment that divided before from after. The moment when ancestors became legends, when the old ways were lost, when humanity had to start over with only fragments of what had been known. And they all encoded the same warning. It happened before, it can happen again. The world is not stable. The coastlines are not permanent. The safety we feel is temporary. And when the waters come, and they will come, only those who prepared, who built boats, who preserved knowledge, who listened to the warnings, will survive to tell the next generation. This is why the flood story persists. Not because ancient people were superstitious and invented myths to explain natural disasters, but because the disaster was real. It was global, it was catastrophic, and it left survivors scattered across every continent with the same memory burned into their collective consciousness. Water rose. The world drowned. We are the descendants of those who survived. The myths are not mythology, they are archive. They are humanity's oldest historical record, preserved in the only format that could survive when writing did not yet exist. Oral tradition, passed from grandparent to grandchild, encoded in rhythm and repetition and ritual so it would not be forgotten. And now, 12,000 years later, when we have satellites and sonar and genetic analysis and ice cores, the evidence is confirming what the myths always said. There was a world before this one. It drowned, and we are what came after. The reset was global. The memory is global, and the warning encoded in every flood myth across every continent is universal. What happened before can happen again. And when it does, will we, like the heroes of old, be prepared? Will we build our arks? Will we preserve what matters? Will we survive to tell the story to those who come after? Or will we become the civilization that future archaeologists excavate from beneath the ruins, wondering how we knew so much and why we did not listen? 12,000 years. That is roughly how long separates us from the last reset. 12 millennia since the Younger Dryas impacts, since the ice sheets collapsed, since 400 feet of ocean swallowed the coastlines and buried whatever civilizations existed there beneath water and sediment and the slow accumulation of forgetting. 12,000 years of rebuilding. From scattered survivors to agrarian villages to urban civilizations to industrial empires to the digital interconnected global society we inhabit now. 12,000 years of progress, of knowledge accumulation, of technological advancement that has taken us from stone tools to spacecraft, from cuneiform tablets to quantum computers, from local tribes to a species that has touched the moon and sent probes beyond the solar system. We stand at a height of capability that arguably surpasses anything the pre-flood world achieved. We have decoded the human genome. We have split the atom. We have created artificial intelligence that can outperform human cognition in specific domains. We have built a global communication network that connects billions of people instantaneously. We have developed weapons capable of exterminating our species dozens of times over. And the question that haunts every advancement, every breakthrough, every threshold we cross, is this: are we approaching the point where the reset mechanism activates again? The ancient texts are clear about what triggers divine intervention. It is not immorality alone. The pre-flood world was not destroyed because humans were sinful. It was destroyed because humans exceeded their design parameters. Because the noise grew too loud. Because the creation threatened to surpass the creator. Because humanity, unified and knowledgeable and ambitious, became capable of things the gods had not intended. Genesis phrases it explicitly. Nothing that they proposed to do will now be impossible for them. That is the threshold. The moment when human capability approaches divine capability. When the gap closes. When the created becomes functionally equal to the creator. We are approaching that threshold again. Perhaps we have already crossed it in ways we do not yet recognize. Consider genetic engineering. For the first time since the Anunnaki allegedly mixed clay with divine essence to create the first humans, we possess the ability to edit the human genome. FRASPAR technology allows us to cut and paste genetic code with precision, removing disease, causing mutations, enhancing desirable traits, potentially designing humans to specification rather than leaving reproduction to chance. In 2018, Chinese scientist He Jiankui announced he had created the first gene-edited babies, twin girls modified to be resistant to HIV. The international scientific community condemned the work as unethical, premature, dangerous. He was imprisoned. But the capability exists. The knowledge is published. Laboratories around the world possess the tools, and the pressure to use them, to eliminate genetic diseases, to enhance intelligence or physical capability or lifespan, will only increase. We are editing the source code of life itself. We are doing precisely what the Atrahasis epic describes the gods doing, taking biological material and modifying it intentionally to produce beings with specific characteristics. We have become the genetic engineers. We have become the creators. And if the reset mechanism is triggered when creation begins to modify itself, when the product starts rewriting its own code, then we have crossed the line. Consider artificial intelligence. For the first time in history, we have created non-biological intelligence. Systems that learn, adapt, solve problems, generate creative output, and engage in reasoning processes that sometimes surpass human capability. We do not fully understand how these systems work. The neural networks that power modern AI are black boxes. We can measure their inputs and outputs, but the internal processes, the emergent properties that allow them to function, remain opaque even to their creators. We are creating intelligence we cannot fully comprehend. We are outsourcing cognition to systems that may, within decades, surpass human intelligence across all domains. And once that happens, once artificial general intelligence emerges, we will no longer be the apex intelligence on this planet. We will have created our own successors. We will have done to ourselves what the Anunnaki allegedly did to us, birthed something that outgrows its purpose. The parallels to the pre-flood narratives are precise. The gods created humans to serve. Humans exceeded expectations. Humans began to rival the gods. The solution was reset. If we create AI to serve us, and AI exceeds expectations, and AI begins to rival or surpass human capability, what follows? Consider weapons of mass destruction. Humanity now possesses the capability to exterminate itself without divine intervention. Nuclear arsenals sufficient to trigger nuclear winter, to render the planet uninhabitable, to end civilization not through flood but through fire and radiation, and the collapse of ecosystems that billions depend upon for survival. Biological weapons capable of engineering pandemics more lethal than anything nature has produced. Chemical weapons. Cyber weapons that could collapse infrastructure and return industrial societies to pre-technological conditions within weeks. The flood required divine action. The next reset might not. We have handed ourselves the button. We have built our own reset mechanisms. And the more advanced our technology becomes, the more fragile our civilization grows. The higher we build, the farther we can fall. Consider climate change, not the political debate but the physical reality. Global temperatures rising, ice sheets melting, sea levels climbing, weather patterns destabilizing, coastlines threatened by storm surge and rising oceans, mass migrations driven by drought heat, crop failures. The irony is almost mythic in its precision. The last reset involved water, melting ice, rising seas, drowning coastlines. And 12,000 years later, we are triggering the same mechanism through our own activity. Releasing greenhouse gases, warming the planet, melting the glaciers, raising sea levels. We are creating our own flood, not in 40 days, but over centuries. Not through divine decree, but through industrial emissions. The result will be the same: coastal cities drowned, hundreds of millions displaced, civilizations built on shorelines abandoned to the waves. The reset will be slower this time, stretched over generations rather than compressed into a single catastrophic event. But it will achieve the same outcome: a dramatic reduction in human population, a collapse of global systems, a scattering of survivors who will have to rebuild from fragments. And perhaps that is by design, not conscious design but systemic design. Perhaps civilizations that advance to our level always trigger their own resets. Perhaps the mechanism is not external at all but internal, built into the trajectory of technological development. A species that gains the power to reshape its environment inevitably reshapes it in ways that undermine its own survival. A species that gains weapons capable of mass destruction inevitably uses them. A species that creates artificial intelligence inevitably loses control of it. The cycle is not imposed from above, it is emergent from within. The reset button is not held by gods waiting to push it when humanity gets too ambitious. The reset button is coded into the nature of advanced technology itself. And we press it ourselves repeatedly, every 12,000 years or 26,000 or whatever the cycle period is, because advancement beyond a certain threshold is inherently destabilizing. This is the dark implication of the flood myths. They are not warnings about divine punishment. They are warnings about the inherent unsustainability of civilizations that reach our level. They are saying we have been here before. We reached this height before. We possessed knowledge and technology and global coordination before. And it collapsed. Not because the gods were angry, but because systems this complex cannot maintain themselves indefinitely. Because every tower built high enough eventually falls. Look at the signs. Global pandemic in 2020 reminding us that despite all our medical advancement, we remain vulnerable to microscopic organisms. Economic systems stressed to the breaking point by supply chain disruptions, revealing how fragile just-in-time manufacturing becomes when shocks occur. Political polarization fracturing societies that seemed stable. Democratic institutions undermined, international cooperation breaking down, nuclear powers threatening each other, resource competition intensifying as populations grow and arable land and fresh water become scarcer. These are not unrelated crises. They are symptoms of a system approaching its limits. A civilization that has grown so large, so complex, so interdependent that perturbations in one domain cascade into others. Where a virus can shut down global trade. Where a drought can trigger refugee crises, where a solar flare could knock out satellite networks and collapse GPS-dependent infrastructure, where cyberattacks could disable power grids and return entire regions to pre-electrical conditions. We have built a global civilization with a single point of failure. Actually, dozens of single points of failure: the internet backbone, the semiconductor supply chain, the oil distribution network, the wheat and rice production zones, the pharmaceutical manufacturing centers, the financial clearing houses. Any of these, if disrupted significantly, could trigger cascading failures across the system. The pre-flood world, according to the myths, was also globally interconnected. Trade networks spanning continents, shared knowledge systems, coordinated construction projects. And when the reset came, That interconnection became a vulnerability. The collapse was total because everything was linked. When the coastlines drowned, the trade routes failed. When the trade routes failed, the cities starved. When the cities starved, the knowledge centers emptied. And within a generation or two, the entire edifice crumbled. We are more interconnected now than at any point in human history, which means we are more vulnerable. The reset does not need to be as dramatic as the Younger Dryas impacts. It only needs to disrupt a few critical systems simultaneously. A major cyber attack plus a pandemic plus a crop failure plus a financial crisis. Not individually catastrophic, but combined, sufficient to destabilize the global order and trigger a cascade of failures that overwhelm our ability to respond. And then the question becomes who survives. In the ancient myths, survival was not random, it was selective. The gods chose, nos Usudra Unapishtim Deucalion Manu, not the most righteous but the most prepared. Those who received warning and acted on it. Those who built boats while others mocked. Those who preserved knowledge while others consumed. Those who understood the cycle and prepared for its next iteration. If the next reset is approaching, if the signs are visible to those willing to see them, then the question facing our generation is the same question that faced the pre-flood survivors. How do we prepare? What do we preserve? How do we ensure that when the collapse comes, and history suggests it will, some fragment of knowledge and capability survives to rebuild? Some are already preparing. Billionaires building bunkers in New Zealand. Tech entrepreneurs funding life extension research. Governments stockpiling seeds in Arctic vaults. Nations developing off-world capabilities. Planning Mars colonies, investing in space infrastructure that would allow human civilization to survive even if Earth becomes temporarily uninhabitable. These are modern arcs. Not boats, but bunkers and seed vaults and rockets. Not preservation of animals, but preservation of data, DNA samples, manufacturing capabilities. The tools needed to restart industrial civilization from a higher baseline than stone tools and fire. But preservation alone may not be sufficient. The myths make clear that the survivors were chosen not just for their ability to physically endure, but for their willingness to remember and transmit what had been lost. They became teachers. They carried knowledge forward. They ensured that the next iteration of humanity did not start from absolute zero, but from fragments that could be reassembled. If we are approaching the next reset, then our responsibility is not just to survive, but to document. To encode our knowledge in formats that will outlast digital storage, which degrades within decades. To create physical archives, stone tablets, metal plates, structures that will survive fire and flood and the collapse of electrical grids. To teach the next generation not just what we know, but why it matters. To ensure that when the reset comes, someone remembers what we achieved, what we learned, what mistakes we made. So the cycle does not simply repeat identically, but evolves. The ancient texts describe the post-flood world as a time of amnesia, knowledge lost, capabilities forgotten. Survivors starting over with only dim memories of what had been. The Sumerians called it restoration because they were trying to remember, trying to piece together fragments, trying to rebuild what the flood had washed away. We have the opportunity to prevent total amnesia. We can encode knowledge. We can create redundancies. We can ensure that if the reset comes, it does not erase everything. The question is whether we will, whether we take the warnings seriously. Whether we recognize the signs not as paranoid catastrophizing, but as the predictable precursors of a cycle that has repeated before and will repeat again. Because the texts are clear, the cycle continues. The flood was not unique, it was the most recent reset in a series. Before the Younger Dryas there were others. Before this iteration of humanity, there were others. The evidence is buried in geological strata, in genetic bottlenecks, in myths that describe not one flood but many, not one age but multiple ages, each one ending in catastrophe, each one followed by renewal. We are not the first advanced civilization. We are the current one. And the question that determines whether we become a cautionary tale or a successful transition is whether we learn from what came before. Whether we recognize that the tower always falls, that the flood always comes, that the reset is not punishment but maintenance, a built-in mechanism that prevents any single iteration of humanity from becoming permanent. From achieving true escape velocity, from breaking free of the cycle entirely. Perhaps the cycle cannot be escaped. Perhaps it is fundamental to the nature of reality, encoded into the cosmic order the same way entropy and decay and death are encoded into physical law. Perhaps civilizations, like organisms, have lifespans. They are born, they grow, they mature, they age, and they die. And attempting to prevent that death, attempting to achieve immortality at the civilizational level, is hubris of the highest order. Or perhaps the cycle can be broken. Perhaps the reset is not inevitable but optional. Perhaps if we recognize the mechanisms that trigger it, if we avoid crossing the thresholds that activate the response, if we develop sustainably rather than explosively, if we coordinate globally rather than compete tribally, if we preserve rather than consume, we can be the first iteration that survives. The first tower that does not fall. The first age that does not end in flood. But that requires wisdom we have not yet demonstrated, restraint we have not yet shown, coordination we have not yet achieved, and time we may not have. The signs suggest the threshold is close, the ice is melting, the weapons are deployed, the AI is learning, the genome is being edited, the systems are straining, the tower is rising toward heaven, and somewhere perhaps the mechanism is activating, the reset protocols are initializing, the cosmic maintenance cycle is beginning its next iteration. 12,000 years since the last flood. How long until the next? The question is not whether the reset will come. History and myth and geology agree that it will. The question is whether we will be among the survivors who preserve knowledge for those who come after. Whether we will build our arks. Whether we will become the ancestors future generations remember. Or whether we will become the cautionary tale. The civilization that reached for the heavens and drowned when the waters returned. The wind passes over the desert before dawn. It carries dust that may have once been temples. Beneath that dust, beneath the ruins, memory waits, memory pressed into clay, memory carved into stone, memory encoded in myths that outlasted empires. The flood was not punishment. This is the realization that changes everything, not divine anger, not cosmic vengeance, not the gods looking down at human wickedness and deciding we had gone too far. The flood was maintenance, a reset button built into the fabric of reality itself, a mechanism that activates when systems grow too complex, too unstable, too close to the threshold where creation rivals creator. It was mercy disguised as catastrophe. Think of it this way. A computer running too many programs begins to slow. Memory fills, processes conflict. The system becomes unstable, unpredictable, dangerous to itself. The solution is not to punish the computer. The solution is to restart it. Clear the cache, close the corrupted files, return to a stable baseline from which operations can resume cleanly. The flood did this for humanity. The pre-flood world, according to every ancient text, had reached a point of no return. Not moral corruption alone, though that appears in the stories, but systemic instability. Nephilim hybrids introducing genetic chaos. Knowledge spreading beyond the ability to control it. Technologies developing faster than wisdom. Populations growing beyond sustainable levels. Noise, the texts call it. The sound of a creation that has exceeded its design parameters. And the solution was not to destroy humanity entirely. It was to reduce it. To preserve a remnant, to save the core while clearing away the corruption, to give creation another chance to develop, this time perhaps more carefully, more slowly, with the memory of what happens when growth becomes cancerous, serving as a warning encoded into every flood myth humanity would carry forward. The survivors were not chosen for their righteousness. They were chosen for their genetic integrity, for their knowledge, for their ability to preserve and transmit. Noah was perfect in his generations, which scholars now interpret as meaning his bloodline was uncontaminated by Nephilim admixture. He was baseline human, pure stock, the kind of genetic foundation from which a stable population could be rebuilt. Zasudra was warned by Enki, the god of wisdom, who could not bear to see knowledge perish entirely. The ark was not just a boat, it was an archive. Seed of all living things means not just animals but information, cultural inheritance, the divine codes of civilization, mathematics and astronomy and medicine and metallurgy. Everything that had been learned in the pre-flood age, compressed into a vessel that could survive the waters and deliver it intact to those who came after. The reset preserved what was worth preserving. And what was worth preserving was not the complexity, not the achievements, not the towers that reached toward heaven. What was worth preserving was the foundation, the baseline, the clean code from which a new iteration could compile without the bugs and corruptions that had destabilized the previous version. This is not cruelty. This is gardening. A gardener does not hate the plants when he prunes them. He cuts away the overgrowth so the core can thrive. He clears the dead wood so new growth has room. He thins the seedlings so the strongest can mature without competition. The pruning looks like destruction, but it is cultivation. It is the active maintenance of a system that left alone would choke itself into collapse. Civilizations like gardens require pruning. Left unchecked, they grow too dense. Resources deplete. Complexity multiplies beyond the ability to manage. Inequality deepens until social structures fracture. Technologies develop that threaten the survival of the species itself. And at that point, collapse is inevitable. The only question is whether it happens chaotically, destroying everything including the knowledge needed to rebuild, or whether it happens with intention, preserving a core from which renewal can occur. The flood was intentional collapse. controlled demolition. A hard reset that cleared the corrupted system while preserving enough functional code to restart. And this is where the philosophy becomes uncomfortable. Because if the reset was mercy, if it was maintenance, if it was necessary to prevent total self-destruction, then the beings who triggered it were not villains. They were gardeners. They were systems administrators. They were the intelligence, divine or otherwise, that recognized when an iteration had reached its limit and needed to be cycled. We call them gods. But perhaps they were simply older, more experienced, operating on timescales we cannot comprehend, watching civilizations rise and fall the way we watch seasons change. Not with malice, but with understanding, with the recognition that growth without pruning becomes cancer, that complexity without periodic simplification becomes chaos, that every tower built high enough will eventually fall, and it is better to guide the fall than to let it happen catastrophically. The Sumerian texts say kingship descended from heaven, not once, twice, after the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again. That word is everything. It means the first descent was not unique. It means the cycle had happened before. It means the pre-flood world was itself a post-reset world. That before the 8 kings who ruled for impossible ages, there had been others. Before the flood that drowned Zeusudra's world, there had been other floods. Before this iteration of humanity, there had been previous iterations. We are not the first. We are the current. And the geological record confirms this. The Younger Dryas impacts 12,800 years ago were not Earth's first brush with cosmic catastrophe. Before that, the Toba supervolcanic eruption 74,000 years ago nearly extinguished humanity. Before that, other events, other bottlenecks, other resets visible in ice cores and sediment layers, and the genetic record of species that survived but lost most of their diversity. The cycle is older than we imagined. And it is not unique to Earth. Perhaps it is universal. Perhaps every planet that develops intelligent life follows the same trajectory. Simple organisms evolving into complex ones. Complex organisms developing technology. Technology accelerating until it reaches a threshold where the creation begins to rival the creative force. And at that threshold, reset. Not because the universe is hostile, but because unchecked exponential growth is mathematically unsustainable. Because systems that grow without limit consume their foundations. Because intelligence without wisdom destroys itself. The reset is the universe's way of preventing that final destruction. It is the circuit breaker, the safety mechanism, the hard limit that activates before the point of no return. And if we understand it this way, if we see the flood not as punishment but as maintenance, then the question changes. We stop asking, why did the gods destroy us? And start asking, what can we learn from the cycle? We stop trying to avoid the reset, because avoidance may be impossible. We start trying to prepare for it, to ensure that when it comes, we are the ones who survive, the ones who preserve, the ones who become the ancestors of the next iteration. This is what the ancient texts were trying to tell us. Not that we should fear divine wrath, but that we should recognize the pattern, that we should see the signs, that we should understand the cycle is not linear but circular, that what happened before will happen again, that the tower will rise and the tower will fall and the tower will rise again. Each time perhaps slightly higher, each time preserving slightly more, each time learning slightly more from the mistakes of the previous iteration. Until perhaps, eventually, an iteration succeeds, an iteration that reaches the threshold but does not trigger the reset. An iteration that develops wisdom alongside technology, that balances growth with sustainability, that achieves complexity without instability. Or perhaps that is impossible. Perhaps the cycle cannot be escaped. Perhaps the reset is not a bug but a feature. Perhaps the universe is designed this way intentionally to prevent any single iteration of intelligence from achieving permanent dominance, from becoming static, from ceasing to evolve. Because evolution requires death, progress requires failure, growth requires pruning, and perhaps civilizations, like organisms, are not meant to live forever. Perhaps they are meant to live, learn, die, and pass their knowledge to whatever comes next. Perhaps the flood is not the end of the story but the transition between chapters. The moment when one age closes and another begins. The Sumerians understood this. That is why they called their work restoration. They knew they were not inventing civilization. They were rebuilding it. They were taking fragments, pieces, inherited memories, and reconstructing what had been lost. They were the post-reset generation doing what post-reset generations always do, salvaging, transmitting. And 12,000 years later, we are doing the same. We excavate their ruins, we translate their tablets. We decode their star charts. We marvel at their sophistication and wonder how they knew so much. But they would tell us, if they could, that they were asking the same questions about those who came before them. That they too stood in ruins and wondered. that they too tried to remember what the flood had washed away. The cycle continues. The pattern repeats. And we, standing here now at the height of our own iteration, face the same choice they faced. Do we recognize the cycle we prepare? Do we preserve? Do we become the ancestors who pass knowledge forward? Or do we believe, as perhaps they believed, that this time is different, that we have escaped the pattern, that our tower will be the one that finally reaches heaven without falling? History suggests humility is wiser than hubris. The myth suggests the tower always falls. The geology suggests the reset always comes. But the reset is not the end, it is the comma in a sentence that continues. It is the rest between movements in a symphony that plays across millennia. It is the necessary pause that allows the next phrase to begin. And if we can see it this way, if we can understand the flood not as tragedy but as transition, not as punishment but as process, then perhaps we can face the next reset, whenever it comes, with something other than fear. Perhaps we can face it with preparation, with determination, with the knowledge that we are part of a cycle older and larger than any single civilization. That our role is not to escape the cycle but to participate in it consciously, to preserve what is worth preserving, to pass forward what is worth passing, to be the link between what was and what will be. The wind passes over the ruins one more time. The clay tablets rest in their museum cases, fingerprints still visible in the dried mud. The flood's silt lies beneath the cities, marking the boundary between worlds. And somewhere, in the genetic code of every living human, in the myths we still tell, in the mathematics we inherited and the astronomy we rediscovered, the memory persists. We have been here before. We survived before. We will survive again. Because survival is what we do. It is what we have always done. It is what the flood could not wash away. The capacity to endure, to remember, to rebuild, to rise from the waters and begin again. The reset is not our enemy, it is our teacher. It shows us that nothing lasts forever, that all towers fall, that all ages end, and that the only immortality available to us is the kind that flows through generations. The knowledge we pass down, the stories we tell, the seeds we preserve, the arcs we build for those who come after. We are not the culmination of history. We are a chapter in a book that continues beyond us. And when our chapter ends, as all chapters must, the question will not be how high we built or how much we achieved. The question will be what we left behind, what survived the waters, what waited in the clay, what the next survivors will find when they dig through the ruins of our age and wonder, as we wonder about those who came before, how did they know? What did they remember? And what warning did they leave? The flood is coming. It always comes, in water or fire or ice or slow collapse, but memory endures, pressed into stone, encoded in myth, carried forward by those who survive, and in that endurance, in that transmission across the boundary between ages, is the only victory that matters. Not that we lived, but that we were remembered, not that we built, but that what built meant something to those who came after. The reset sweeps over, the waters rise, the tower falls, and from the ruins, again across ages without number, humanity begins anew, smaller, simpler, humbled, but alive, and remembering, always remembering. And so we return to where we began, to the present moment, wherever you are listening from right now. The past whispers through fragments of clay and stone, but we are here, present, alive, still asking questions, still wondering what came before and what lessons might be waiting in the dust. That capacity to wonder, to seek, to remember what was forgotten. That is what makes us human. That is what survived every flood. If this journey through forgotten history resonated with you, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe if you want to explore more mysteries that sleep between myth and geology. Your support helps keep these stories alive, helps ensure that memory, even uncomfortable memory, continues forward. And perhaps that is the real message hidden in those ancient tablets. Not just what happened, but that someone cared enough to write it down, to preserve it, to send it forward through time to us. We do the same now in our own way, remembering, questioning, sharing. The flood was not punishment, it was reset. A cosmic maintenance cycle built into the rhythm of civilizations that grow too fast, too high, too unstable. And the survivors, people like Zusodra and No and Manu and Deucalion, were not chosen for their righteousness but for their willingness to preserve. To carry the seed of all living things, yes, but also the seed of all knowing things. The mathematics and astronomy and medicine that would allow the next age to begin not from zero, but from fragments. We are those fragments, assembled. We are the inheritors of a cycle older than we imagined, and we stand now at a height that perhaps matches or exceeds what came before. Our towers rising, our knowledge expanding, our technologies approaching thresholds that make even us uncomfortable. The question is not whether the next reset will come. The question is whether we will be ready, whether we will preserve what matters, Whether we will become the ancestors future generations remember with gratitude or with sorrow. The clay tablets cannot answer that. They can only whisper what happened last time. They can only show us the pattern and trust that we are wise enough to recognize it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for wondering with me. Thank you for carrying this story a little further into the future, wherever it goes from here. The flood memories circle the planet, every culture, every continent, every people who survived to tell the tale. They are not myths, they are testimony, and the testimony says we have been here before, we survived, and if we are careful, if we remember, if we prepare, we will survive again. Until the next mystery calls us back into the ruins, may your present be peaceful. May your questions lead you somewhere meaningful, and may you rest well tonight, knowing the story continues. The wind passes over the desert one last time, the clay waits beneath the sand, patient as stone. And memory, encoded in wedge-shaped marks pressed by hands 5,000 years dead, still whispers in the darkness, we were here, we remembered, we survived. Good night.